the village swordsman honed his skills. His movements were crisp and fast, able to slice through an enemy in a split second. In addition, the man was very good at footwork. He skillfully moved at the same time as his sword, moving in unison with it. The swordsman delivered a powerful blow with his weapon, exposing the sword in front of him. All the while he was focused only on the very tip of his sword. After the last blow, his weapon began to glow brightly. Everything around seemed to freeze, watching his skill at this moment. After that, the man decided to retreat back and prepare for the next attack. His body was covered with bruises and scratches. With that in mind, the swordsman wasn't even going to stop. Landing on the ground, he confidently looked in front of him and began to prepare for an attack. Delivering a flurry of blows, the man created a real light disco around him. The glare from the blade of his sword reached all the nearest points. Village swordsman moved smoothly in a circle, shuffling with his feet. He used the technique of 24 plum blossoms but decided to improve it a bit. He did much less than expected from one of the best technicians in the world. The Hua Mountain technique consisted of 24 consecutive steps. Village swordsman made only 8 and delivered the final blow. He held the sword in front of him as if cornering the enemy. The man's hair slowly developed in the wind, giving him an incredibly heroic look that suited him incredibly well at this moment. Village swordsman looked straight ahead as if seeing the future. He was able to perfect the 8 plum blossom technique. After his workout, the man exhaled and rested as best he could. His training was constantly watched by 2 old men who simply could not believe their eyes. They opened their mouths wide in surprise when they saw the advanced technique of 24 plum blossoms. A new star had shone in their Mount Hua sect. One of the old men immediately approached the swordsman named Taos and made suggestions to him. According to the old man, the swordsman should have taken responsibility for the Mount Hua sect. The village swordsman bowed his head and answered his older brother that he could not take on such a responsibility. The old man was just shocked to hear this. He asked Taos to think carefully about this proposal, as he believed that there was no one else in the sect who could wield a sword so skillfully. Taos took a deep breath and sank into thought. Mount Hua was the place where he was born and lived his whole life protecting his relatives. The village swordsman replied that he agreed to teach the future talented students everything he could but refused to take on the role of leader. The elders could not understand the man's thoughts at all. They remembered that from childhood he was distinguished from others by his talent, but he never wanted more. Looking at the village swordsman's face, the elders felt that he only needed to take one step to compete for the role of leader, even in the Wudon sect. The elder brother decided to remind the man that any leader has his flaws. Taos asked not to mention the last offer again. The men understood very well that by refusing such an offer, the village swordsman could leave Mount Hua and go wherever he wanted. Based on these thoughts, the elder brother reminded Taos that he should keep his word and stay on Mount Hua to teach future students. Taos bowed his head to his elder brother and promised that he would fulfill any other request of his, including preparing the future generations for hardships. The village swordsman stayed on the mountain and began teaching talented students. Time passed very quickly. Outside, spring has come and brought the rains with it. Almost imperceptibly, summer came, and the same tree shone with bright green colors, spreading its leaves under the sun's rays. Autumn also crept in almost imperceptibly, and the tree turned red. Its orange leaves began to fall to the ground, signaling the inevitable passage of time. In winter, there are almost no leaves left on the tree. The years continued to pass, and only a steadfast and old tree remained irreplaceable on Mount Hua. For several years, Mount Hua has hardly changed. The elders continued to lead their sect, preparing the future generation to do the same. The top of the lotus flower was the main residence of the Hua Mountain sect. It's been more than 10 years since Taos training, so things have changed a lot. The old man strode confidently forward, shuffling his feet. He moved as slowly as possible because his age no longer allowed him to run as fast as before. He began to climb the stairs and move even more slowly. The man held a sword behind his back, a red tassel dangling from its hilt. Taos admitted that he was already too old, and even a light breath of wind could knock him off his feet just by accidentally blowing in his direction. Holding his weapon firmly behind his back, the old man continued up the stairs. He felt the strength continue to leave his body with each step. Finally, the swordsman almost reached his goal, climbing to the top of the lotus flower, where he was greeted by the bright sun along with the old graceful buildings. Taos began to look around and did not understand what was happening here. Nature has changed a lot, but something has remained the same. The buildings were the same as they were several decades ago. The buildings continued to stand strong despite their solid age. The old man continued to walk forward towards the central entrance. Local residents suddenly noticed how a very respectable guest was approaching them. They immediately turned to face the great swordsman and bowed their heads before him. The men greeted the elder by folding their hands as a sign of respect. Taos walked past the locals and assumed it must be cold here. He told the men to hurry and move inside the building. Looking at the great elder's back, the men wondered when they would be able to gain even some semblance of energy. The man's hair was still growing heroically in the wind. His outlook had hardly changed over the years and remained as confident as ever. Das was heading to a hall called Yuching. An important meeting awaited him here, for the sake of which the elder came to the top of the lotus flower. Going inside, the man saw in front of him bright red curtains which were on all the windows and incredibly matched the interior. It was very light around considering the large number of windows. Huge wooden columns supported the building, which had been standing for more than 100 years. There were 9 people in the main meeting hall, including the leader who was sitting on the edge of the table. They did not speak to each other and waited for their guest. Finally, the door to the meeting hall opened and a large swordsman stood in front of the men, holding his weapon behind him and confidently looking ahead. Those present immediately rose from their seats and bowed before the great elder. The leader also greeted the old man with folded hands. Das said that he finally managed to come here. The elder was surprised that everyone was present and asked the leader if he had made a decision after all. Sect leader of Mount Hua Te Pyongjia replied that they could not fail those who believed in them and looked to the sect as their support. The great elder asked the interlocutor, maybe he is just looking for an excuse, but we need to find a way to get out from under the oppression of the Wudon sect. The sect leader continued to be in his place with his wards. He received a question: was it not clear that the Wudon sect was following the same path? Taepyeong-ja bowed his head to the elder and, closing his eyes, offered his apologies for not being able to predict the course of events in advance. Dao looked coldly at the sect leader and tried to find the right words to motivate the locals to change the course of their progress. The elder remembered the proverb and told the man that a sharp knife can become dull very easily, as can a mind that is constantly working without stopping. Daos asked the interlocutor, what is the point of having a golden house and a jade palace at all if the obsessive thoughts of the thoughts will not allow even to sleep peacefully inside? The elder remembered that it had been more than 100 years since he last entered here, but his heart continued to beat with the same frequency. Daos could not believe that his disciples had abandoned the way of Tao, instead choosing worldly cares that forced them with all their might. Those present felt a little uncomfortable when Daos referred to them as those who had undergone rejuvenation but fell into a frenzy and put earthly desires first. After that, the old castle closed for a few minutes and absolute silence reigned in the hall. The elder stood by the central entrance all the time without moving a single step. Hua Mountain sect also remained in their seats and did not dare to sit down. They were waiting for the verdict of the elder. Taos at some point decided to break the dead silence and turned to Te Pyongjia, which incredibly scared everyone present in the hall. The sect leader was simply shocked when the elder said that he would no longer be able to see him, so he asked him to lead the Hua Mountain section well. At this moment, Te Pyongjia remembered how he was at the training of the whole master. Daos as now carried the sword with the red tassel. Then a satisfied smile appeared on the man's face from how his best student was learning and taking everything he needed from his teacher. Taepyeong-ja trained very hard, giving his best every day. He followed his teacher's instructions without moving a single step from this path. Now everything was completely different. Between the student and the teacher there was a breakable wall which the leader of the sect could see right in front of his face. The man sharply turned to the elder and asked why he behaved so arrogantly. Taos replied that he would rather continue wandering the world with his sword. After a clear and comprehensive answer, the Grand Elder left the meeting hall and headed in the direction of the exit. Men watched only his shadow. Hua Mountain sect leader was in absolute shock after meeting the elder. The wards immediately approached the man and asked if everything was okay with him. Pyonga's face Ja seemed to hate the elder to the bone. The man remembered that Daos had always been a person who could not be trained by anyone. The leader clenched his left fist tightly and mentally asked the old man if he really believed that his decision could help the sect that was once closest to him. Continuing to stare at the old man, Tae Pyongjia addressed him, informing him of the incredibly heavy burden that he now had to carry personally. The man also wanted to restore the sect's past glory, but he disagreed with the elder because they lacked people to implement all their plans. He understood that understanding the reason did not mean that the elder's indignation would immediately disappear, and that in a few months they would be able to solve all the problems. The sect leader finally dared to break the dead silence in the hall. All the wards looked only at the leader, expecting something incredible from him. Tae Pyongjia said that there was an event right on their noses, that they simply could not miss the article of the 6th Hwa Mountain Dragon Tournament. Das at this moment continued to leave the meetings, and out of the corner of his ear, he could hear the sect leader talking about the very important Hwa Mountain Dragon Tournament. All the attention of those present was focused on the leader of the sect. Tae Pyongjia bowed his head and announced that the 6th article of the Hwa Mountain Dragon Tournament would begin now. In an era when the level of martial arts reached its peak, the provincial leadership took the initiative to deal with the evil deeds of the Murimu warriors. After this decision, an era of persecution by the leadership began, which went down in history under the name of bloody riots in Murima. Prestigious sects had to exercise caution for some time. One of these sects was Mount Hwa. One of the 9 great sects was no exception. Most sects could not avoid the weakening of the economy. The Mount Hwa sect found itself in an incredibly difficult position compared to the others. This was due to their connection with the Yuden sect. While the Wudon sect was able to recover quickly thanks to the authority of the Daos, the Mount Hwa sect weakened under their influence. Hwa Mountain sect were certainly not satisfied with this situation. If the sect was losing its prestige, it also affected the business of its representatives. The sect members understood that they had to make some kind of decision. Very soon the Hwa Mountain sect came to a decision that changed the balance of power. They decided to gather all the representatives and hold a martial arts competition. This attracted the attention of people who were not members of the Hwa Mountain sect. Of course, they were allowed to be present at these competitions, but just to watch. The young man with black hair asked the guests to hurry up in order to be in time for the start of the competition. It was very interesting for the guests to watch the competition because previously ordinary people were not allowed to watch such a competition, so it caused a real sensation. The competition brought very unexpected results. Locals really liked such an event because it caused a lot of emotions and could distract from everyday affairs. 2 warriors collided with swords in the arena and the battle between them began. There were completely different people in the stands and everyone supported their favorite. From the beginning, the main sect just wanted to support their inner members and help them improve their fighting skills in the arena. However, over time, the warriors got to know each other better and the battle became more than a competition for them. They began to share each other's problems and desires. Because of this, the competitions were held as honestly as possible and without unnecessary emotions. Men fought with swords without any hesitation and with respect for each other. The defeat of one of the participants was inevitable. When the young man was on the ground, loud ovations rang out from the stands. Previously, it was established that the defeated can do whatever he wants. However, these competitions were different. The one who found himself on the edge of the sword did not suffer from abuse, but rather the opposite. The winner helped the loser to stand up, holding out his hand. The winner apologized to his opponent for any inconvenience and said that he was just lucky to be half a step ahead this time. The one who lost the match bowed before the winner and asked him not to apologize because he was also this time a whole step behind. The result of this fight was also watched by the guests. In the stands was the same man who was burning with the desire to attend an event open to all. He liked it incredibly and wanted to send his son to the representatives of Mount Hwa. The representative of this sect asked if it would not be a better decision to send his son to the Yuden sect. The guest asked how a man could say such a thing after what had just happened. The guest liked that the Hwa Mountain sect opened its doors and was hospitable. The sect member replied that the leadership had indeed made the right decision, as rumors of what was seen today would quickly spread and Mount Hwa would become great again. The internal representatives were able to unite thanks to this event, and thus Mount Hwa informed everyone that it was able to survive and thrive again. This was the end of the first selection of the Hwa Mountain Dragon Tournament. A few years later, men in red cloaks began to distribute postcards of the same color. A local resident received a similar letter and immediately opened it. He began to read the inscription with a serious and completely indifferent face. Travelers walked through the territory and met people on their way to whom they gave letters. That's how invitations to the tournament began to spread. Hua Mountain Dragon Tournament, despite its popularity, still needed promotion, as the sect tried every way to regain its greatness. Subsequently, they decided to hold the tournament every 20 years. A lot of time has passed and the sixth selection for the Hua Mountain Dragon Tournament has begun. There were surprisingly few people in the central market today. These were mainly women who were leisurely returning to their homes. The travelers handing out invitations were heading to the gathering of the Heavenly Dragon, whose residence was located almost in the very center of the village. It was a huge wooden estate with a blue roof in the shape of the letter S. There were stone paths around it proudly welcoming guests. Near the entrance to the manor were two flags on which the golden name of the Heavenly Dragon was carved. The flags stood strong, sometimes developing in the wind. The owners offered the guests to stay with them for a while and relieve their fatigue. The travelers could not accept the offer because they were carrying out a task from the sect leader. The Grand Master of the Heavenly Dragon gathering felt somewhat uncomfortable at having to see off his guests in a hurry. Hua Mountain Sect apologized to the Grand Master and thanked him profusely for the warm welcome and the absence of any problems. The old man asked his guests to wait a little and turned to the young man who was behind him. He addressed him by the name of Hym Hen. Mok Hym Hung was the second master of the Heavenly Dragon gathering and the son of a Grand Master. He was holding a red bag in his hands that he had prepared for the guests. Hua Mountain Sect immediately decided to give it up. Hym Hyung continued to insist on the gift as he would feel uncomfortable otherwise. In the end, the guests had to take away the red bag inside which there were gold coins. The Grand Master decided to equip the travelers with everything they needed. Mok Hym Hyun smiled at last and said that they couldn't take care of them today, so a pouch is the least they can offer them. The Grand Master scratched his beard and asked the guests if they were refusing a gift just because he came from a minor branch. Hua Mountain Sect denied this information and immediately looked at each other to understand each other and come to a common opinion. In the end, the men thanked the Grand Master for the gold and said that they would not refuse again, so as not to offend the Grand Master. Hua Mountain Sect left the building and headed towards the village to complete their unfinished business. After a little thought, Hym Hung raised his head and said that he didn't want to rush, so it was better to clear his mind and then he would fix his sword. The Grand Master said that he would not interfere with his son because the young man already possessed a sufficient arsenal of skills and would soon surpass his father. Hym Hyung asked the Grand Master what he thought about sending Peon to the Sword Dragon tournament, since the man was 27 and ready to participate in the tournament. Shaking his head a little, the old man said that was a pretty good idea. The Grand Master suggested that Peon could indeed become a famous disciple of a famous master. Hym Hyun replied that he would like to have a sister because even if they were not destined to win the tournament, the sister would definitely be able to win all 4 flags. The father took offense at his son for a second and called him too self-confident. Hym Hyun immediately realized his mistake and promised his father to be as careful as possible. After interrupting his son's apology, the Grand Master admitted that he had the same train of thought. Hym Hyung was just shocked to hear that. Literally, after a few hours, deep evening came. The lights started to come on in the houses. One of these was the profound Dao Hall. Using the candlelight, the man inside sat at the table and opened the letter he received today. He read what was written and raised his head. A man named Ban Du Chong was a profound Dao Hall master and was nicknamed the Golden Sword of 6 Harmonies. He asked his ward if he could atone for his offense. The great successor of the profound Dao Hall named Bong bowed before the master and said that he was ready to carry out his order because his skills were at the right level. Ban Du Yung wanted his ward to subdue a swordsman known as Mok Hym Hung and brought the Golden Heavenly Dragon match to the profound Dao Hall. Giving this order, the master of the profound Dao Hall tightly gripped the piece of paper in his hand out of anger, because he had lost to Mok Shin Pyong in the past, and now only had the Heavenly Dragon silver sword. Bang Du-yung was not satisfied with this situation, so he wanted a change. Confidently looking at his ward, the master hoped that very soon he would be able to climb to the top. Zhong Waterways Trade Bureau also received the same letters. The entrance to the bureau was closed because it was already the appropriate time of day outside. The owner of this very trading office, Xia Danwon, opened the letter with the red envelope and began to read it with the most serious face. After reading the letter, the man's face did not change at all. All he could think about was that his plans were finally starting to work for him. The master of the Waterways Bureau Hanjong suddenly asked for a guest. It was his son-in-law named Muval, whom the owner immediately let in. Muval was the head of the trade bureau of the Hanjun Waterways. He went to his father-in-law and bowed before him, wishing him a good evening. Opening his eyes, the son-in-law was simply shocked at the unexpected turn of events. He saw in front of him something that he did not expect to see tonight. With frightened eyes, he looked at his father-in-law's hands and saw a bright red letter with the emblem of one of the 9 great sections. There was paper inside. Muval could immediately conclude that an invitation to a famous tournament had arrived. It was a complete shock for him and unexpectedly put him in a stupor. Xie Danwen looked at his son-in-law and said only one word, inviting him to participate. He looked at him with a cold and piercing gaze. Muval bowed before his master and said that he would do everything in his power. Muval was entrusted to represent the Hanjun Waterways Trade Bureau. Xie Danwen continued to look at his son-in-law with a cold gaze and thought of his old acquaintance, whom he also expected at the famous tournament. Just the thought made the man smile sinisterly. He thought that this time he would definitely destroy the illusion hanging over his head. The representatives of the Manhwa sect went further on their journey and were now on Mount Dingjun, which was further to the east. The men discussed among themselves the long road ahead of them. They were very tired and wanted to rest and eat. The brothers were heading to a small village. The younger brother did not like the fact that they were sent to help the peasants, although they knew absolutely nothing. Songhak let out a breath and said that he would like to visit the Waterways trading office where he could have a decent snack and something to look at. An older brother named John Huck asked his partner to be patient, as they would have to walk a few more kilometers before they reached the village. Suddenly Songhak noticed the incredible size of the fields in their path. Considering the lack of news about the famine, it seemed strange to the man that the peasants here were starving. In addition, the land here always bore fruit and traces of its cultivation were visible. Songhak believed that the peasants here should live in complete abundance and prosperity. Chonghak suddenly interrupted his younger brother and informed him that there have been rumors for a very long time that this area is actually under the control of a bandit stronghold. Chonghak added that there are no big cities around, so the villagers do not have to expect protection from the leadership and they are literally forced to make ends meet. Songhak suddenly felt guilty after learning the situation. If his older brother had told him this earlier, he would have spoken much more kindly about the villagers. Suddenly the younger brother shouted loudly and offered to make a return road through the mountain where the bandits are hiding and help the villagers in their time of need. Chonghak replied that he certainly has a similar desire, but there are more than 100 people in the ranks of bandits, which seemed simply an incredible number. Songhak asked if they don't study martial arts in order to help people and become heroes, not just to achieve enlightenment through training. Chonghak understood his younger brother's anger very well. Continuing to listen to his cries, he approached the younger man and put his hand on his shoulder. Chonghak said that he was also guilty of this situation, but there was absolutely nothing they could do against 100 men who were well armed. The elder brother added that they needed to become much stronger in order to do justice, and only then could they return to Dingjun Mountain. Songhak smiled and agreed with his brother. The man also added that it would have been possible to send their master here if it had been closer to the top of Hua. But now the brothers' first priority was the order from the sect leader. That is why, after talking a little about their future, they went on to carry out the task. After several hours, the representatives of the Mount Hua sect finally managed to reach the village of Hvaran. It was located among fertile land and dry trees. A man with a shovel was going to work in the field himself when he was suddenly interrupted by one of the local residents who loudly asked the master to stop. The master asked if his ward had plowed the land. The man replied that he had already done everything and asked the master where he was going in the evening. Peyijong replied that he was bored with plowing the land in the usual way, so he decided to use a new method and invited a man with him. The peasant asked if it was possible to do this with this old shovel. The master replied that he took the shovel just in case so as not to waste time. Hearing the sounds of the peasant's stomach, Peyijong immediately decided to send him home. The master advised the man to go home and get some rest. Of course, the peasant immediately ran back to the village because he was incredibly hungry. Peyijong jumped off the track and landed right in the middle of the field. He was left alone with the uncultivated land. The man stood firmly on both legs and pressed the shovel in his right hand just as firmly. After standing like this for several seconds, the master sharply raised the shovel in front of him and changed his grip. He took the tool with both hands and began to lower it down. Yijong completely placed the shovel on the ground and bowed before it. It looked rather strange, reminiscent of the rite of some old tribe of Indians. The master always bowed to his native land before starting to cultivate it. After standing like that for a few seconds, the man opened his eyes. Yijong started to get to his feet. Pushing himself off the ground with his hands, the master took his body from the cold ground and went to work. Before that, the man clenched his right fist and said that the past year was full of blessings and asked for a good harvest again. The master began to speak to the weeds, hinting to the plants that they were not of the right kind to occupy the lands that nourished them. Yijong lifted the shovel from the ground and held the city in his hands, apologizing to the plants for having to interrupt their prosperity on this earth. Standing as if in a combat stance, the master smiled and added that he would definitely give the plants a rest later, but today was definitely not their day. Yijong raised the shovel to head level and began to spin it in one hand. He displayed incredible abilities as if he was about to start a martial arts match. Spinning the tool several times in his right hand, the master jumped into the air and swung the shovel, intending to drive it into the ground. A powerful sound could be heard in the field as the instrument entered the ground. Yijong landed next to the shovel and let go of its handle. The entire lower part of the shovel ended up sticking out of the ground. Yijong exerted so much power that it was difficult for an ordinary person to reach for a shovel. Of course, the man was unusually average and easily managed to get a tool that he stuck into the ground. Sand fell from the tip of the shovel. As soon as the master got the tool out of the ground, a curtain of earth immediately began to form around him, which seemed to go crazy at that moment. Of Inchan, which was lost in the incredible amount of earth dust that filled the air in a matter of seconds. The master turned his head back and smiled in the face of the noxious plants. With sarcasm in his voice, he asked if they liked his new treatment. The man did not wait for an answer from the plants, which was not surprising. After that, he started working again and began to shovel the earth from one side to the other. Inchong then walked over to the tallest Kachugura. He managed to throw and took in a full lungful of air before blowing away the dust to see the plants. The man fought against pests that took away nutrients from agricultural crops. He pulled out weeds and carried them away from the garden. Inchan looked incredibly happy doing his not-so-easy job. The man seemed to be in training where he was improving his skills. Having done a lot of work, the master decided to rest a little. He leaned over his tool and decided to look at the finished result of his work. Inchong was pleasantly pleased with how his affairs were progressing. He loved to spend time alone in the field, alone with his tool and the earth. Having rested a little, the man resumed his dancing. He planned to work 4 days without stopping to bring some kind of offering to the village god. Suddenly, Perinjong was forced to interrupt his work when his son came to him. The man immediately asked the child what happened to him. Paseohyun looked a lot like his father. He informed his father that his grandfather had sent him here and told him to immediately bring his father to the village. Inchan told his son that he was busy. Paseohyun said that the matter is urgent because people in red uniforms have come to their village. The master was a little surprised to hear such information from his son. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and immediately understood which people we were talking about. Paseohyun reported that the guests fell asleep as soon as they ate, so he compared them to a pet that can only eat and sleep. Inchan smiled and appreciated his son's joke. After that, the man climbed out of the mud and patted his son on the head, continuing to smile. The master advised his son to be more careful with his words, as one should not compare people with animals regardless of their lifestyle. After a short wait, father and son went back to the village. It was already night outside. Inchan spent the whole evening in the field working with a shovel. When the master returned to the village, he was a little surprised. Local residents were waiting for him, who went outside to talk to the master. Paseohyun, meanwhile, was sleeping soundly behind his father's back. Local residents reported to the master that unexpected guests appeared in their village today. A man named Cho Rek informed the master that the guests currently staying with them came from the Hua Mountain sect, which literally shocked everyone. After hearing all the information from the local residents, Inchan ordered them to go to their homes and promised to find them all tomorrow. After saying goodbye to the residents, the man went to his home with his son. His wife was waiting for him there. The woman was very beautiful and always waited for her husband. Pa-in-chan gave his son to his wife and asked him to pour him glasses of water with a sad expression on his face. The woman silently took her child in her arms. After that, she looked at her husband for several seconds and did not understand what was happening. He always came home in a much better mood. The woman felt very well that something was wrong. In addition, the man went to the room where he entered very rarely after returning home. Pa-in-chan entered the room where there was a single bed and a lighted lantern. The master greeted the master of the room and said that he had come home. The bed was occupied by an old grandfather with gray hair. He held a letter from the Manhwa sect in his hand and handed it to the man. Pa-in-chan knew very well that he was responsible for the violation. The old man was sure that the man would achieve good results at the famous tournament. Opening the letter, the master looked at the old man with a serious look and asked why he needed a result that he could achieve. The old man looked at the man with a surprised look and did not understand the question at all because you could enter the tournament only by invitation. In the end, the old man did not answer the man. There was complete silence in the room. For some reason, Pa-in-chan was not going to leave the room. Grandfather closed his eyes and lost himself in thought, trying to find the words to give the man some impetus to move on. The old man knew how to persuade young people and decided to play on his emotions, telling the man that he could do as he wished. Pa-in-chan immediately renewed his interest in dialogue with the old man. He began to think about what to do to him because a lot could depend on it. At that moment, the wife entered the room and brought her husband a glass of water. She stopped at the entrance and began to wait for a reaction from her husband. Pa-in-jeong was not very keen on the competition as he had a lot of garden work to finish. However, the old teacher did not think so. He wanted a better future for his student. He closed his eyes and raised his forehead. The old man thought about his problems in deflecting his internal chi, which prevented him from becoming a better teacher for his student. He opened his eyes and looked at the man, assuming that he could become the strongest martial artist if he was trained by someone else. The old man chastised himself for not being able to recover from his leg injury an hour earlier and prepare for departure. He was too hasty. The teacher shed a tear, realizing the fact that he brought his student only problems and gave him absolutely nothing because of his worthlessness. After talking with the old man, Pa-in-chan went to sleep in his room with his wife. They lay on a wide bed and tried to sleep. Pa-in-chan lay face up with his eyes closed. He snorted loudly each time, gathering as much air as possible into his lungs and slowly exhaling it. The wife couldn't fall asleep that night and watched her husband all the time. She could clearly see that there was definitely something wrong with him. The woman felt that her husband wanted a completely different future but could not give up the current situation because of his family. The wife focused her attention on her husband's face and remembered how happy he had been in the past when absolutely nothing held him back. She imagined Pa-in-jeong beginning his training with the master. At that time, he was still an ordinary young man who had almost no knowledge of martial arts. However, very soon the young man began to turn into a real talent. The master was satisfied watching the work of his best student. A young girl sat at a table near a tree and watched her fiancé. She got incredible pleasure from the smile of her future husband. The future wife imagined her husband's future and smiled. A slight blush could be seen on her face. Pa-in-chan enjoyed his life practicing martial arts. His progress was very interesting to watch. Now the wife looked at her unhappy husband and wondered if it was possible to return everything to the way it was before. After looking at the face, the woman mentally said that she should believe and not stand in the way of a man who needs free breathing. Suddenly Pa-in-jeong opened his eyes and saw someone's face in front of him. He was a little scared as he had almost fallen asleep a few seconds before. Getting up from the bed, the husband asked why his wife was awake. The woman said that the man now has many students but he needs to progress. She looked at him with serious eyes and added that he must not back down and must grab hold of his dream by setting out on the road. Pa-in-chan did not expect such a turn of events. He was simply shocked because before that he had never heard such harsh statements from his wife. He just looked at her brave face, which took responsibility for the family, and decided to let her husband go, making him a free bird. Pa-in-chan took his left hand out from under the blanket and took his wife's hand. He slowly placed his limb on the bed as he grabbed his wife. The man said that the outside world has no meaning for him and he needs absolutely nothing as long as his wife and Seo-hyun are around. Pa-in-chan smiled pleasantly at the woman's face and said that he was not going anywhere, although deep down he thought completely differently. The husband's wife felt the same way, for whom the last words sounded like a mental cry that could not escape in any way. Pa-in-chan hugged his wife after this evening's dialogue and asked her not to think about it. After a few hours, the family peacefully fell asleep thinking about the future. The morning of the next day came very quickly and the master students were already in the field. From the very morning they started working to constantly improve. They took their tilling tools with them and began to work the land by hand, swinging their picks from behind their shoulders and moving steadily forward. The men were sweating profusely, but she wasn't even going to stop. One of them even managed to take off his clothes, although it was not very hot outside. He planted his foot firmly on the ground, keeping his balance for the strike. His leg muscles said that the man had been working in the fields for a long time. He swung the pick behind his back with all his might and hit the ground again. This continued until the students could stand on their feet at all. They were quite hardy as they spent several hours in the garden every day. It was a very good endurance workout. The picks continued to hit the ground steadily. The men did not stop for a second, training their endurance and doing good deeds at the same time. At some point, one of the men stopped and turned to his older brother. He asked if there was a need to plow the entire garden for 6 cows. The older brother asked in response if his younger brother was going to achieve results in training without making any effort. The man was immediately invited to start training. The elder brother took the tool in his hands and asked if this is not what they are doing now. In his opinion, the field was the best location for training. The man added that others may look down on their training, but they would never be able to achieve these results with regular training. The older brother showed off his body and asked if his muscles were similar to the body of an ordinary country boy who only cleans cows. The third brother intervened in the conversation and agreed with his eldest. He shouted loudly that his neighbor was really starting to like his hands. After that, the men began to discuss their master, who was about to go to the competition. In their opinion, this would be a rather difficult test for a man. The elder brother objected and said that the master had learned everything he needed before the elder brother noticed a deviation in his internal chi. The younger one asked if the master would really agree to go to the competition. The elder brother shook his head and replied that it was a difficult question to answer. He remembered the enemies who constantly threatened their village. The enemies were ordinary bandits, but their leader was at least called the King of Dingjun Mountain. Now the bandits have stopped acting since the master beat them last time. The elder brother understood that the situation would change when Pa-in-jong decided to leave the village. After some thought, the elder brother came to the conclusion that he needed to become stronger as soon as possible in order to be able to protect himself and his village. The younger brothers supported the elder and said that they were ready to change with him because in this way they would stop being a burden to their master. At dawn, the guests of the village of Ren set out on the road because great things awaited them. The sun just rose from behind the horizon and barely illuminated the environment. The brothers in red cloaks confidently stepped forward, looking ahead. They behaved much more discreetly than before on the way to the village. The fact is that the only master in the village was walking in front of them. Pa-in-chan nevertheless agreed to the offer and decided to take part in the competition. Chong-huk looked at the man's back and felt something strange. Why was it unpleasant to watch him, as if deep in his soul he was afraid of him? He could not understand who was accompanying whom, judging by the man's behavior. Pa-in-chan strode confidently forward without saying a word the entire time. A dead silence broke around, which was sometimes broken by light breaths of the wind, which swayed the bare branches of the trees that had prepared for winter. Song-hak is very tired, just like his brother. The younger one was very ashamed and afraid to break the silence and offer their companion to rest. Chong-huk admitted that he had underestimated the village master. Now he saw the man moving forward for several hours and his breathing remained stable. Chong at first had assumed that the master might just be faking, but with every step he took he was sure that Pa-in-jong wasn't tired at all. Suddenly the elder brother turned to the master and informed him of the presence of Dingjun Mountain around the corner, suggesting that he bypass it and return another time. Pa-in-chan replied that if they had already decided to go this far, then he needed to go up the mountain and see what was going on there. Chong-hak did not deny the man absolutely anything. He understood that for the craftsman from the village, His enemies were like wolves lurking near his house. Chong Huk was simply shocked when the master turned to face him. His eyes widened and were startled by what he saw. Pa Ingzhong stared in the direction of Dingchuan Mountain with his incredibly fierce eyes. It was this that frightened the representative of the Hua Mountain sect. The master from the village was as serious as possible. He said that he was going to go to the mountain alone and that he was not to be worried about. The companions still had some distance to cover before parting ways. They were about to reach a turning point that separated their paths for a while. Upon reaching it, Po Inchan bade farewell to his guides and asked them to be more careful. Chong Hak promised to give a report on arrival so that the necessary measures could be taken. Pa Inchan bowed to his allies as a sign of respect and thanked them for their concern. The representatives of the Hua Mountain sect promised to provide all necessary assistance. The brothers also thanked the master for his company and his kindness. They hoped that they would meet again very soon on Mount Hua. After that, the paths of the companions diverged. Pa Ingzhong headed in the direction of Dingchuan Mountain, while the members of the Hua Mountain sect went in the other direction. The brothers continued to go forward. Song Hak expressed his incredible displeasure at the fact that they couldn't get anything to eat. He was already very angry. Suddenly the younger brother stopped, not seeing his partner. He turned his head back and wondered where his older brother was. Song Hak saw his brother behind him and asked why he stopped in the first place. Didn't he want to get to a place to eat as soon as possible? Chong Huk took a few steps forward and announced that he was still thinking about the village master's eyes, which he did not like very much. Chong Huk asked his brother if he hadn't noticed the murderous look in the master's eyes, that he wasn't just going to survey the area but to attack his enemies. The older brother added that he had heard from the monks that such a look can only be seen when preparing for a battle to the death or when meeting your worst enemy. Remembering the look of the village master before his eyes, Chong Hak made sure once again that he went to fight hundreds of bandits on Dingchuan Mountain. Song Hak asked what was the point of doing that, since the older brother himself had spoken of the inevitable death in such a case. Chong Huk offered to go back and check his guesses. Song Hak didn't really want to do it. Instead, the elder brother wanted to make sure of the reality of the arrogance and confidence of the master, which pressed on him all the way. Chong Huk offered to just look, and if there was danger they would retreat. Song Hak did not want to face the master anymore and called him crazy. Chong Huk completely agreed with his younger brother. He turned to him and shouted loudly, offering to check how crazy the man was. Song Hak no longer objected to his older brother. He had no more words left. The man had no choice but to follow his partner. Song Hak could only say that he was endlessly hungry, but this problem only bothered him personally, which made the man even shed a tear. Chong Hak had already gone ahead, so Song Hak had to catch up with him, shouting loudly for his older brother to wait for him. The headquarters of the thieves was located on Mount Dongqin. These were wooden houses surrounded by a fence made of logs sharpened from above. Inside this shelter sat a man named Li Guzhenwu. He was the leader of local searchers who looted local villages. Once this man had dreamed of obeying as the leader of another group, but now he was forced to settle for having only 10 wards. Li Husanwu reflected on his current situation and realized that it was not the worst he could achieve in his years of fruitful and not very honest work. The only thing that did not suit the man in the new place was boredom. It was incredibly boring for him to sit around all the time and wait to rob someone. Suddenly one of the wards approached him and offered to rob Yu's village in order to steal one woman. Li Husanwu flatly refused, referring to the decision of the headquarters. The man asked how the headquarters knew about it. Li Husanwu calmly explained that if they started looting now, there would be no one to loot during the harvest. The leader of the robbers remembered that the harvest would begin literally in a matter of days. They only had to wait a little while to break the bank. Suddenly the ward interrupted his leader's thoughts and pointed a finger at the forest path. He said that the prey came to them by itself and there was no need to go anywhere. There really was a person on the forest path. It was Peinchong, who put on his hood and confidently moved forward to meet his enemies. Li Husanwu looked at the traveler and realized that he could either belong to the forces of justice or to the madmen or to the newcomers who wanted a truce. The village master came closer and closer to the top. Li Husanwu assessed the guest with his eyes and did not understand why he behaved so relaxed in someone else's territory. The wards suggested that the leader report this event to headquarters. The commander refused because he did not want to seem like a real nobody in the eyes of the staff. Also, Li Gyuzenwu really wanted to stretch his limbs, as his sinister smile indicated. He ordered to group and prepare to meet the guest. Pa In-chan paid absolutely no attention to anything and continued to walk forward. The man hid his face before facing the enemy. His eyes were completely emotionless and stony. The master came here for one purpose only and was not going to stop halfway. Suddenly Pa In-chong put his foot down and stopped. He was very surprised to see unexpected hosts on his way who came out to meet him. In front of him, the master could observe a dozen thieves armed to the teeth. They hid on the forest path, taking advantage of the terrain. Pa In-chan immediately understood that these were unusual people. He duly appreciated the choice of their position because he himself did not even notice their presence. Li Husanwu looked at his opponent's face and couldn't understand what was wrong with him. The guest was not at all afraid, having met bandits on his way. Moreover, Pa In-chong began to prepare himself for the duel. He understood that the battle was inevitable, so he began to endow himself with a flow of internal qi. The leader of the Seekers, together with his wards, watched the potential enemy with horror on his face. They perfectly understood that this is a far unusual traveler. Li Husanwu began to worry about his team's situation. He saw in the enemy's face incredible courage, as well as a frightening flow of energy. The owners of the mountain were in no hurry to attack their opponent. They were a little afraid and dug in and stood in place, displaying their weapons in front of them. Li Husanwu, like a real leader, nevertheless gathered his strength and shouted loudly, ordering his wards to teach the uninvited guest on his territory. Immediately after this order, the bandits moved from their places. Two of them jumped into the air and quickly headed in the direction of the unknown man. In a fraction of a second, they were above the enemy's head. The bandits brandished their weapons and were ready to cut his body into small pieces. Pa In-heng confidently raised his eyes upwards and coldly looked at the enemies. He was not going to die so easily given his urgent task. Bandits were simply shocked when the enemy disappeared literally before their eyes. They did not understand what had happened and where the man had gone. Suddenly, one of the bandits with a bald head felt a powerful touch on his face. Pa In-jung touched with his right hand covered in energy. He did the same to another bandit. The man found himself right between his enemies, appearing in the most unexpected place for them. Applying the power of his inner qi, the village master easily defeated the two enemies. He knocked them to the floor with one touch. After that, Pa In-chong flipped in the air and successfully landed on both feet. His opponents fell helplessly to the ground, throwing away their weapons. The men lay motionless on the ground and could not move. They were in complete shock, and the body seemed to refuse to obey them. Li Husanwu ordered his charges to gather together immediately and continue their attack. The leader was oblivious to what had happened to the previous bandits. One of the man's wards immediately went behind the strangers and delivered a powerful blow with his sword, but the master noticed the danger in time. Pa In-chan turned to face his enemy and immediately dodged his blow. The blade of the sword passed by several centimeters and missed the target. After that, the master used his right leg to attack. He hit his opponent on the supporting leg so that he could no longer stand on his feet. The bandit by no means expected such speed from the opponent. He began to lose his balance and fall down, unable to grab onto anything. Pa In-chan, on the other hand, grabbed his enemy's face. He saved him from an inevitable fall, but it was still too early to thank the man. The master literally stood still for 2 seconds and looked at his opponent. He began to imbue his hand with inner energy. The bandit was very scared when he felt a rush of energy on his face. The man perfectly understood that it would not lead to anything good. Without taking a single step, Pa In-chan powerfully pushed his opponent with one hand, knocking his head back. The man began to fall. The thug landed right on his ally's back. The rest of the thugs stood and watched their partner get kicked. One of the Seekers suddenly moved from his place and decided to join the fight. He swung his sword and shouted loudly, ordering the enemy to die. Pa In-chan had a slightly different vision for this situation. He was absolutely not confused and remained standing still, watching the movements of the enemy. As soon as the master saw the danger approaching, he immediately moved from his place and avoided a blow that passed a few centimeters from him. The bandit hit his sword in front of him with all his might, trying to hit his opponent. However, he managed to hit only the rock behind the master. The man raised his sword and saw that his attack had failed completely. He was holding half of the sword in his hand, with which it was impossible to continue the duel. Pa-in-chan launched a counterattack immediately after that. Pushing off the ground, he stood next to his opponent and placed his right hand on his body. The bandit lowered his gaze in the direction of his stomach and saw the master's hand, which had already made a push by using the internal energy. The man could not understand what had happened. His gaze was completely blank and he had absolutely no time to even scream. In a fraction of a second, the bandit was already a few meters away from his opponent. With incredible force, the master threw the bandit to a great distance. The man flew back, meeting an obstacle on his way. He landed right on top of his ally, preventing him from continuing the match. Both men fell helplessly to the ground as they continued to slide. Only one leader was left standing on the ground, who was in complete shock. Li Husan-woo stood on the battlefield with his mouth wide open in surprise. He had already regretted running into this stranger 10 times. Pa-in-chan wasn't going to stop there. He used his inner energy again, covering his hand with it, and was about to teach his opponent. The seeker leader watched his enemy and saw the color change on his arm. He had seen this before when he served in the Black Shadow Cavalry. The man remembered that in the ranks of the cavalry they heard about Decole who had black hands, but it turned out that this was just a side effect of taking medicine. Pa-in-chan was not going to wait for his enemy to prepare for defense. The master immediately moved from his place, which greatly complicated the opponent's position. Li Husan-woo was forced to react quickly to the situation. He began to retreat back and swung his sword to prepare a counterattack. The village master perfectly saw every move of his opponent. He braced himself for a preemptive strike and aimed to avoid further trouble. With the help of his energy arm, Pa-in-chan deflected the opponent's counterattack, hitting his right arm. Thus he knocked out the weapon from the man. Li Husan-woo was in an absolutely losing position. His right hand was out of the fight and the enemy was just beginning to act instead. The master placed a hand on his opponent's left shoulder using his inner chi. The bandit leader immediately felt the side effect. Pa-in-chan pushed his opponent, knocking him several meters back. Li Husan-woo now fully felt what his charges were feeling. The man tried to break, but the speed was too high. Eventually he landed and lowered his left arm, which was wounded down. Li Husan-woo felt excruciating pain in his left shoulder. He screamed loudly from this pain and understood that he could not win this match. Pa-in-chan slowly approached his opponent and looked into his eyes. The man admitted that his enemy was physically strong but absolute in battle, and not now. Li Husan-woo loved life very much, so he quickly started changing his shoes. He asked his opponent to take pity on him and promised to do anything to anyone. Pa-in-chan took his time to answer his enemy. He looked at him with his superior gaze and thought about what decision to make. Li Husan-woo continued to kneel and hold his shoulder. He hoped that the enemy would still make the right decision for him. Pa-in-chan, after being silent for a while, told the man to lead him. The leader of the searchers did not understand anything and asked what the enemy meant. The village master said that the leader should take him to headquarters and then he would think about saving his life. Li Husan-woo rose to his feet and asked his opponent if he could first administer first aid to himself and the wards who had been injured in the battle. Pa-in-chan looked at the interlocutor with a sinister look and said that he did not have time. The man asked, "Does the thief want to die on the spot?" Li Husan-woo understood that jokes with the interlocutor were bad. He immediately retracted his words and said that he would immediately take his opponent to headquarters. The leader of the Seekers left his wards behind. They lay on the ground completely unconscious. In the end, they were lucky to at least stay alive. Walking forward, the leader constantly looked around. He managed to assess the uninvited guest and realized that he was a swordsman because he was carrying a large sword behind his back. Li Husan-woo was able to feel the power of this man on his own skin and decided that he wanted to become a leader and destroy all those who disagreed with him. The current leader's shoulder was incredibly painful, and he did not know whether he would be able to reach the headquarters at all. Besides, he had danger right behind him. Despite the pain in his shoulder, the leader of the Seekers continued to move forward. All around were high rocks and dry trees that somehow survived in the mountains. Pa-in-heng followed his enemy and was a little surprised. They suddenly began to descend, which contradicted the data that was known. Li Husan-woo understood very well that the man might find their path suspicious, so he smiled and said that the road always goes up and down. Suddenly Pa-in-chong stopped when he saw something strange in his path. He looked up and heard the sound of a fast shell. He noticed an arrow moving incredibly fast towards the west. A red mark was shuffled near its sharp end, which was a certain signal. Pa-in-chan was immediately alert and realized that they might be ambushed. He immediately came to the conclusion that the man in front had decided to set him up. Li Husan-woo hastened to dispel the doubts of his enemy, and said that he did not have a hand in this, and the wards decided to report the enemy to the headquarters without him. The master decided to believe this man and looked up again. He once again heard a strange sound that was identical to the previous one. After the first arrow came the next one, which was an absolute copy of the previous one. The seekers sent another arrow to relay the information to headquarters. Li Husan-woo told the master that these two arrows were a sign of enemy invasion. The man added that now all the headquarters will know about the presence of the enemy. However, the leader emphasized that thanks to his escort, the master will be able to get to the headquarters without any effort, since now Li Gyuzin himself is among his allies. The leader continued to stand out in front of the new, in his opinion, leader, acting as a brave guy who is ready to take risks for the sake of his partner. Pa-in-chan stood still and listened intently to the interlocutor. Now he realized that he was flattering him because he thought that the master wanted to take the place of leader. Li Husan-woo exhaled after his speech. He was trying to turn the tide in his favor in case this man did become their leader. He smiled in the master's face and repeated his name, asking him to remember it and emphasizing that such shots should not be scattered. The master watched the enemy completely coldly. After a short report, the leader of the Seekers continued to move forward in the direction of the central headquarters. Pa-in-chan strode confidently behind his opponent, carefully watching his movements. There were high stones all around from which no plants grew at all. The master immediately drew attention to such relief. He understood that trees grow almost everywhere, but in one place they are not observed at all. As soon as the enemies realized that the enemy had determined their location, they immediately jumped out from behind the rock and surrounded the enemy that came into their territory. Li Husan-woo decided to defuse the situation a little. He asked his allies to calm down and introduced the man behind his back as his lord. Pa-in-chan cautiously surveyed the enemies behind him. He could hear the men whispering to each other, trying to come to a common opinion. In the end, the warriors decided to listen to the leader of the Seekers and lowered their weapons. They let them pass on, continuing to look after them. When the path was clear, Li Husan turned his head back and turned to the master, informing him of a safe path where they would no longer be in danger. After going through the ambush, Pa-in-chong had to admit that it was pretty good. The man realized that quite unusual bandits live here. Pa-in-chan was heading towards the headquarters to find out what happened here after the master's battle. Thanks to a not very faithful opponent, the master got to the mountain itself. The headquarters was guarded by many bandits holding cold weapons. They stood all over the territory of the headquarters of the coma, observing the changes in the environment. Suddenly, the two guards who were stationed right at the central entrance saw a very strange picture in front of them which they had not seen for a long time. Just in front of them was an uninvited guest who had arrived here together with the leader of the Seekers. Pa-in-chan stopped in place as he passed the inspection. The members of the bandit group looked at the stranger and assumed that this could be a new contender since he looked quite serious and even murderous. Some were quite skeptical and were already preparing a coffin for the newcomer. They were ready to fight over bookmarks how long this applicant could last. Pa-in-jung listened to all these conversations behind his back and showed no emotion. He understood that he had a completely different goal and did not need to pay attention to anyone. Dingjun Mountain was surrounded on all sides by bandits. They were guarding an important figure who could not be allowed to suffer in any way. The king of Dingjun Mountain sat on his throne in the form of a wooden stool with his hands folded in front of him. He was obviously a bit bored and was expecting a guest to arrive. The king of the mountain was called Zhang Il Pen. A pleased smile appeared on his face in which one could see evil intentions. The situation that happened 20 years ago with teacher Pa-in-chan took place on Mount Jonan, where the family lived for quite a long time. A rather modern house for those times was located on the mountain. There was a small vegetable garden in the backyard which brought fruit to the family year after year. The father stood over the body of his wounded son and tried to cheer him up somehow. Before that, he persuaded him to stay, but he did not listen to him. Now the father had to say motivational phrases so that his son would not give up. He said that he did not want any warriors but still to have a reliable son by his side. A middle-aged man was lying on the bed and was about to die. His lips were dry and his skin began to crack not only from defeat but also from shame. When the father mentioned his son as part of the Zhuangnan and Qing Mountains, the man immediately remembered the talented young man who had been constantly training in the past. This young man was himself. He never gave up and trained every day, improving his skills and surpassing his peers. The father taught his son everything he knew. He admitted that his son was a peaceful person but believed that one day he would be able to reach incredible heights. Father was constantly thinking about the Hua Mountain Dragon Tournament because the prestige of their sect was falling unlike the others. One day after completing his training, the son turned to face his father and said that he wanted to fight the heavenly dragon even now. The father was surprised and asked what his son meant. The young man replied that the prestige of the heavenly dragon group was growing every day, so Zhuangnan Mountain needed to do something about it. Father reminded that the heavenly dragon was incredibly strong compared to other students. The young man replied that it was precisely because of this that he had an incredible desire to fight with him. The son was very serious and tried to make his father believe in himself. He smiled pleasantly and promised his father that he would definitely win this battle. However, the world turned out to be much crueler than the young man expected. After the battle with the celestial dragon, he found himself in bed completely defeated. The father became gray after this event and no longer saw the point of living in this world if he would be left without even the closest person on whom he had high hopes. Realizing this fact, the old man went to one of the tables and took a knife. He stood not far from his son's bed and pointed a sharp weapon at himself. Without thinking for a long time, the man swung the knife at himself, and the weapon flew rapidly in the direction of the stomach, absolutely without hesitation of its owner. The son saw that the father wanted to commit suicide. He didn't want that, so he immediately got out of bed despite the pain and held his hand out in front of him. He tried to stop his old man, but time was running out. The father still managed to injure himself and blood spilled on the floor. The son just managed to grab his father's hands, which were already near his stomach. The father opened the wound in his stomach with his own hands. Internal organs were damaged, which caused bleeding from the mouth. The son looked at his father's disfigured face and understood that it was his fault. The young man was completely shocked by this turn of events. His frightened look stopped on his father's face, and the man remembered this picture for the rest of his life. As the old man began to fall to the floor, the young man realized that there was no need to make hasty decisions. Now he had only to shed a tear. His eyes were increasingly filled with bitter liquid. The young man mourned his father who gave his life because of his single and irreversible mistake. The boy could not stay in the house any longer, so he immediately moved from his place and ran outside. He needed some fresh air to recover. The young man began to fall to his knees and screamed loudly, begging the supreme gods of Zhuangnan Mountain to help him turn the past back. The son himself perfectly understood that this was impossible. All that remained for him was to raise his head to heaven and weep bitterly for his dead father. The old man was left lying in the house with an open wound in his stomach. He dropped the knife not far from him. Blood was slowly forming a pool under his body. Suddenly he began to open his eyes. The old man cursed Mount Zhuangnan and mentally promised himself that he would never dare to return here again. He saw a light in front of him in the window. Father felt incredible pain throughout his body, but he did not stop it at all. Despite being stabbed through and through, the old man began to get back on his feet. Coughing, he knelt down and looked at the blood on the floor. After that, the old man grew to his full height and was about to leave Zhuangnan Mountain in this state. The man was not going to look for the easiest way. Painchong simply came to the king of Dingzheng Mountain. Janiel Pen was in no hurry to accept the stranger and decided to ask him a few questions. The king continued to sit on his throne with his arms crossed in front of him. He asked the warrior what kind of person he used to be. Painchong stood in front of the king and took his time to answer the question. He needed some time to consider his next course of action. The man remembered that since the formation of the seeker group and the king has held his position while the leader has already been changed twice. Master looked at Li Guzhenwu, who really did not deceive him, and simply brought him to the headquarters. The man managed to get as close as possible to the main target. One of the warriors who surrounded the king watched the stranger very carefully. He felt a certain danger, so he behaved very cautiously. Like the king, this warrior understood very well that a stranger cannot be trusted, especially one whose age cannot be stated immediately after meeting. The man glanced at the stranger and felt an immediate urge to reach for the sword as soon as their eyes met. Pa-in-chan looked away from the king and looked at the warrior to his right. It was as if he was reading the thoughts of his enemy penetrating his consciousness. Dingxian Mountain understood very well that this stranger would most likely turn out to be an enemy who wanted to infiltrate their rear. Absolute silence reigned between the interlocutors. She was suddenly interrupted by the village master, who asked if it was really so important to talk about the past. He reminded the king how easily he had dealt with his adversary who had brought him here. According to the man's skills should be in the first place. The military commissar, who immediately suspected the stranger, offered him to reveal his face and personality, and only then they could talk as frankly as possible. Pa-in-chan smiled and asked if they really thought that an honest person would actually come to them. Those present were simply shocked at such a question. In addition, the village master knew the name of the man opposite him. He asked if he would have to face the cunning sword fox named Zhuo again. The warrior opposite was simply shocked. He did not remember this man's face. He was alarmed by the fact that the stranger had come here purposefully. Realizing the fact of danger, Zhuo immediately reached for his sword, as he understood that the enemy could attack him at any moment. Pa-in-chan expected a similar reaction from his opponent. He looked at the man with a murderous look, as if inviting him to a duel. A loud cry with an important message rang out throughout the entire territory of Dingxian Mountain. The man reported the presence of the enemy on their territory. Prince Heng did not expect such a quick reaction and began to shake his head in different directions. He did not understand what was happening behind his back. Meanwhile, one of the king's deputies ordered his wards to go outside. The soldiers carefully listened to the instructions of their captain. After that, they quickly went outside, leaving the king's room. They needed to quickly find the enemy and eliminate him on their territory. The village master was in absolute confusion. He thought that there should be one enemy here, but suddenly other figures appeared. In any case, decisions had to be made quickly in Incheon. He planted his foot firmly on the ground to finally take action. The man got a very good opportunity to catch his opponents by surprise. He pushed off the ground with all his might, leaving only dust behind. Perinjong flew towards his old acquaintance with incredible speed. There was nowhere to retreat. It was necessary to start a battle. Zhuo was in absolute shock at what was happening. Information reached him that there are representatives of the heavenly dragon on their territory. However, now he had completely different problems. He looked at the man in front of him and suddenly recognized the movements he had seen with his own eyes several years ago. Pa-in-chong watched his opponent's reaction carefully. In those frightened eyes, he could clearly see that Zhuo remembered their last meeting. It happened 5 years ago. One of the squads of searchers, led by their commander, moved towards the village of Hveran to finally rob it. The commander of this detachment was Zhuo. The man learned that the old defender of the village had lost his inner energy, so he chose the best time to attack. The warriors frantically moved forward after their commander. They finally had the opportunity to rob the richest village that could always stand up for itself. When the old man noticed a disturbance in his inner chi, Pa-in-chong took charge of the village and went out to meet the enemies. Zhuo, driving to the entrance to the village, suddenly stopped and looked at the stranger. He didn't understand what this madman was doing. The commander ordered his men to continue moving forward and ordered the insane peasant to get out of the way immediately to stay alive. The man was very surprised when the local resident did not move at all. Drops of sweat appeared on his face from excitement. Pa-in-heng wasn't going to back down a single step. Instead, he, on the contrary, got up from his place and rushed into battle to defend his village. He swung his right hand and delivered a powerful blow, striking his opponent. It was the man's first fight for his native village. Zhuo was in absolute shock and did not expect that there were any masters left in this village. He only knew a sick old man. The commander paid the full price for his imprudence. He did not have time to react to the young man's attack and was forced to take the blow, losing his right eye. Now Zhu could say with confidence about the boy from Warren. He shouted loudly, informing everyone present of the enemy's abilities. It didn't matter to Incheon at all, but how much did he know the level of the army of Mount Dijon? He decided to conquer its peak, so there was no turning back. Having approached the enemy at the right distance, the village master put his right hand in front of him and concentrated the flow of energy on its end. The king of the mountain was on the way to the man. Janael Pen was just shocked. He saw that he was in danger. He had absolutely no time to react. The man lost his balance after meeting his opponent and flew back. On his way, he met one of the wards who softened his fall a little. Pa In-chan was not going to stop there and continued to give nightmares to the king. He swung his left hand to admonish the man once more. With incredible speed, the man grabbed the Mountain King's hand, squeezing it tightly. Janael Pen at this moment did not understand anything at all. The village master took advantage of the right moment and twisted the man's bone in the other direction. A loud, unpleasant crunch sounded on the battlefield. Janael Pen grabbed his wrist and let out a loud cry of pain. The man did not expect that the enemy would be so strong. One of the warriors present immediately decided to take revenge for his king. He went behind his opponent and swung his left hand for a strike. Pa In-chan did not expect such a turn of events and was forced to react as quickly as possible. He turned his face back to assess the situation. Seeing the concentration of energy on his enemy's left arm, the man decided to do the same to answer his opponent in kind. Two warriors collided in a blow. Pa In-chan counterattacked his enemy with almost identical force to be able to retain the upper hand. The village master's plan turned out to be a bit of a failure, and he came out weaker in this encounter. The man flew away several meters and turned over in the air. Despite this, Pa In-chan was still on full alert. He drew his sword from behind his back to attack his opponent by surprise. The enemy was indeed completely shocked by the speed of his opponent. He stood silently and waited for the man to cut his throat. Instead, the match was watched by another representative of Mount Dinzian. He realized that it was time to intervene in the duel and pushed himself off the ground. The warrior put his sword in front of him and headed in the direction of the enemy, trying to cut him to pieces and save his ally. Pa In-chan was forced to retreat to the defensive. The man began to dodge the sword strikes, sometimes blocking them with his weapon. The porcupine-haired man decided to take advantage of his opponent's weakness and attacked him from behind, trying to grab him and defeat him. The village master quickly made a decision and twisted in the air, landing on his hand. Now he faced two opponents at the same time. The man pushed off the ground with his left foot to be able to attack his opponents at the same time, catching them both off guard. The man with the sword continued to charge at the enemy, swinging his weapon. He followed no strategy and just tried to hurt his opponent. Pa In-jeong jumped into the air and did a somersault, simultaneously kicking one of the enemies and dodging a sword strike at the same time. After that, the master squeezed the sword in his hand with all his strength and began to cover it with internal energy, giving himself incredible strength. Pa In-jeong used a technique called Rain of Falling Plum Blossoms and headed towards the main enemy that was a little further away. Doing a backflip, the master cut off the hand of his old friend. Zhou Mengdong was left without a left limb and began to lose blood. The man was simply shocked by this turn of events because he did not even notice how the opponent approached him and was able to deliver a fatal blow. The master landed behind his opponent, still holding the sword in his hand. His advantage on the battlefield was as obvious as possible. Zhou Mengdong knew that he had to continue fighting despite the loss. He quickly turned back to assess the situation. Before the man could do this, Pa In-chan put his free hand in front of him and placed it on the enemy's back using his inner chi. Zhou Mengdong had neither the opportunity nor the time to counterattack the enemy, so he simply absorbed the blow, flying several meters away from his hand. The man landed face down on the floor, continuing to lose blood. He again lost a match to a man from the village of Kvirin. After finishing with the commander, Pa In-chan turned his head back as he understood that he had enough detractors in this room. The warriors of Dingxian Mountain stood unmoved in their places with weapons in their hands. With frightened faces, they looked at their opponent and did not know what to do next. Meanwhile, two brothers from the Manhwa sect were spotted on the street. The warriors were forced to take out their weapons and start fighting given the situation. Pa In-chan cast his eyes on the street and did not understand why the men followed him at all, because a few minutes ago their paths diverged. The village master understood that in this case his situation worsened and he needed to think not only for himself but also for his allies. Judging by the situation, Pa In-jeong decided to help the brothers and rushed towards the front door to join the fight outside. Janael Pen immediately noticed the enemy approaching them with incredible speed. He ordered the wards to immediately stand in the man's way. Pa In-chan knew perfectly well that they would try to block him. That was why he once again used his inner chi and used the vanishing winter plum technique. The real difference from the village master began on the battlefield. He began defeating his opponents one by one without stopping for a second. The brothers from the Hua Mountain sect watched the match from the sidelines. They were simply shocked by the skills of the man who decided to invade. Pa-in-chan, having joined the fight on the street, lost the perfect chance to win. The man understood that now he would have to sweat a little. Pa-in-chan had saved his allies, and the man who had led the enemy right into the lair was now forced to take a beating. The king of the mountain was extremely displeased with one of his wards. He kicked him with his feet with the aim of punishing him for the previous act. Janiel Peng continued to beat his ward. Suddenly, he was interrupted by another one who was caring for the wounded commander. Zhuo Mengdong was feeling. The man replied that his spine was completely broken due to battle damage. The commander was not in the best condition. His caretaker suggested that the man may not even recover and will remain disabled for the rest of his life. Janiel Peng asked who was their enemy. The ward replied that most likely it was a student of Chorandana from the village of Kvirin with whom they do not have a very good relationship. The king remembered this perfectly, but they had not raided the villages for 5 years, so this step was as strange as possible. Janiel Peng believed that when Chorandan stopped protecting the village, the villagers would not pose a threat, but the man of the same color was very wrong. The king of the mountain assumed that he could not go far from Vren, so he decided to shoot arrows at him, from a large number of which the man could not evade. Janiel Peng ordered his wards to immediately begin searching for their enemy, stressing that they could not lose him on their territory. The ward immediately agreed with his leader and said that he was immediately going to search. Janiel Pen turned his back to the interlocutor. The man walked away from the king and wondered if this was the best decision. He understood that they would have no room for error in their court garden. The ward cast a displeased look in the direction of the leader and mentally said that if they failed, they would suffer a lot of casualties. Meanwhile, Pa-in-chong moved up the high slope of the mountain with his allies. They managed to escape only thanks to the skills of the village craftsman. The younger brother was not feeling well. Pa-in-chan noticed how the man suddenly began to sag in a low position, losing consciousness from incredible exhaustion. The master managed to catch the man before he fell to the ground. Chong Huk was very worried about his brother and wanted to help him. Pa-in-chan informed the man that the best help for his brother would be to get out of here now and preferably as soon as possible. The master looked at the interlocutor and asked if he could move faster, emphasizing that he would have to sweat a lot during the move. Chong Huk himself understood their situation very well. He silently nodded his head and agreed to any terms just to save himself and his brother. The man perfectly understood that he himself had brought his brother to such a position. In addition, he spoiled the master's plan with his unbearable curiosity. The allies entered the cave they met on their way. Here the village master provided first aid to the victim, dressing his wounds. Pa-in-chan reassured his older brother and told him that everything would be fine. Chong Huk asked if they shouldn't go down the mountain for better safety. The master replied that they would not be able to escape from riders on horses who knew the terrain well. The man added that it would be possible only for him alone. At this point, Chong Huk was once again convinced that his idea was a failure. Now he and his brother were only a problem for the village master in this situation. Pa-in-chan suggested that his elder brother stay here for the night and heal his wounds a bit while he himself prepared to go on a reconnaissance. The master understood that the enemies had most likely started looking for them if they were not stupid. The man put on his hood and left the cave. Chong Huk looked after his ally and realized his worthless position because he could absolutely not help with his skills. The elder brother remembered how Pa-in-chong suddenly burst into the battlefield and began to protect them from the opponents, destroying absolutely everyone in his path. Jinkian Mountain representatives were contorted with fear at this moment. They didn't know how to defend themselves against someone they couldn't catch up to. Pa-in-chan kept his allies behind him and brushed off his enemies. They slowly moved back to be able to escape from here. At some point, the master turned to face the brothers and, holding out his hand in front of him, ordered them to immediately get up and go as far as possible. Chong Huk, not objecting to anything at all, took his younger brother by the arm and headed forward, continuing to watch the village genius. Pa-in-chang told the allies that a master could be found anywhere, not only in the Manhwa sect, because a master could be an absolutely ordinary person. Pa-in-jeong possessed incredible skills according to Zhang Haka. He managed to control his internal chi with ease, demonstrating his level. Several hours passed and the master returned to the cave with an arrow in his hand. Taking the first step inside, the man immediately asked about the well-being of his younger brother. Chong-huk replied that his brother's internal organs did not appear to be damaged and the bleeding had stopped. Pa-in-chan ordered to get out of here after dark. Chong-hak immediately understood that the master wanted to fight the enemies alone and tried to dissuade him by offering help from Manhwa. Chong-huk literally froze after his last words. He did not even prove the sentence, although there was no one to interrupt him in the cave. The man caught the confident and murderous look of the master, who stopped at him. Prince-heng didn't answer at all and just stared in front of him. At one point he turned his back to the interlocutor and told him to do as he wanted, and in turn he could not leave the opponents alive. Chong-huk again made a mistake and did not think at all about the fact that the existence of the master should remain a secret. The elder brother endangered the entire village of Fren. Prince-heng was by no means angry with the representative of Manhwa. He walked silently to the exit of the cave and raised his left hand with an arrow in his hand. After that, the man swung with all his might from behind his shoulder and shot the arrow into the sky. He needed to distract the enemies and give them the wrong signal. After releasing the arrow, Pa-in-chan turned to face his ally and said that he would distract the opponents and the brothers should get out of here. Finally, the man added that Chong-huk kept his mouth shut about the situation for his own safety and the safety of his wounded brother. Midnight came very soon. Absolute silence reigned in the surrounding areas of Jingsuan Mountain, and only the howling of wolves sometimes disturbed it. As the village master had ordered, the members of the Hua Mountain sect left the cave as darkness fell and headed for a safe place. They just walked forward, not paying attention to anything. Meanwhile, they were watched by a man who was on top of the mountain. This man was Pa-in-chan, who was also chastising himself for today's situation. He wondered why he had taken such an unnecessary risk. The man perfectly understood that today he could die. Despite this, he was not going to stop because the village had to be saved. As soon as it got dark, the members of the Jingqian Mountain sect put down their torches and began to walk around the area, trying to find at least some clue. They slowly walked in the parade, lighting their way. It was noticeable that they were not very diligent in carrying out the task that came from the king of the mountain. The two men walked forward and were shivering from the cold. Their thoughts absolutely converged at the expense of the weather, which was not at all pleasing at night. Pa-in-chan tried to stay as high as possible so that he would not be found. He saw opponents in front of him, but he was in no hurry to attack them. The man reached into his inner pocket with his right hand to retrieve something useful. He did it as slowly and leisurely as possible. Taking out some red, incomprehensible object from his pocket, the village master brought it to his mouth and bit off a piece with his front teeth. One part remained in his mouth and the other in his right hand. The man looked at the full moon and prepared himself for the fact that the knife would be difficult. A few more minutes passed and absolutely nothing happened on the mountain. The moon illuminated the lion's share of the territory, but there was still a lot of shadow. Pa-in-chan hid between the rocks and did not show himself to the enemy. He was a master of disguise and performed the task absolutely without mistakes. The man moved forward, leaving a breath of wind behind him. At some point, the master pushed off the ground hard to fly into the air. For a few seconds it hovered above. His shadow was illuminated by the full moon. The man flew forward like a bird without looking back. Again, like a bird, Pa-in-chan spread his arms out to his sides like wings to increase wind resistance and stay in the air longer. He performed the same maneuver with his legs. Pa-in-chan's goal was to fly as far as possible, otherwise his mission would fail. The master was stationed above a small settlement called Fairy Peak. Like an eagle, he began to hunt down his prey from below. Having chosen the right house, the man landed on the roof standing on all fours. It was very difficult to land quietly, but somehow he managed it. Pa-in-chan breathed a sigh of relief and began to listen to his surroundings. He managed to penetrate the rear of the enemy completely unnoticed. After that, the master began to drop to his knees, resting his hand on the roof. He smoothly placed first his right and then his left hand on the roof. After that, the man slowly bent to his hands and began to listen to the sounds that could be heard inside this house. Pa-in-chan heard voices discussing the next plan. The young man realized that the enemy was preparing something intending to use a lot of manpower. Jingqian Mountain sect were very surprised when they heard about the cash commander because they did not want to lose many people during the task. Jan Peng agreed with the riskiness of this mission, but he had no other choice considering the enemy was too strong. The king reminded his wards of the madman's power and admitted that even he with his weapons would not be able to resist him. However, Jan Pen, during a meeting with the enemy, everyone notices his weakness. He reminded that the enemy had missed his chance to win when he started rescuing the allies. The king of the Jingxian mountain decided to play on this weakness of the opponent and attack the village of Vren, where there was practically nowhere to hide. The man's plan was to shoot a lot of arrows at the village. He was sure that the master would choose other people's lives. In addition, Jan Pen reminded them that they needed provisions, and with this mission they would kill 2 birds with 1 stone by taking away the food. Pa In-chan heard everything with his own ears. He was simply shocked by the plan and understood that he really couldn't do anything in that situation. Jan Peng asked one of his charges if he had any poison. Having received a positive answer, the king ordered to prepare poison for a detachment of crossbowmen. Jan Pen emphasized that the target of the Blood Phoenix crossbow squad would be their main enemy who would not be able to dodge. Pa In-chan did not expect such a turn of events. His eyes widened in surprise as he realized the seriousness of the situation. The village master began to get to his feet because there was nothing to listen to. He heard enough to spring into action. Pa In-chan had no choice but to attack his enemies right now because otherwise his village would almost completely die out. Realizing this, the village master swung his right leg and exerted his maximum internal energy to catch his enemies off guard. He made a powerful kick on the roof of the house and broke through it. A loud explosion rang out in the rear of the enemy, which surprised everyone present. The roof of the house collapsed. The wood began to fall to the floor, forming a curtain through which almost nothing could be seen. Those present in this building immediately turned their heads in the direction of the explosion but could not see anything because of the dust that blocked their view. Perinjong took advantage of his momentary advantage and immediately threw several wooden planks in different directions where he saw the light. The target of his attack was not people at all. The master saw a slight flash of light through the curtain and decided to extinguish the candle that illuminated the room. Also, the man did not forget about another source of light that he was able to see in the dark. He needed an edge, so this solution was the best. Literally, in a fraction of a second, absolute darkness reigned in the room. Both candles located opposite went out at the same time. Jingxian Mountain sect were in a not very pleasant situation. They began to panic, and how many saw absolutely nothing. Jan Pen immediately ordered his men to find a source of light to see the enemy. So far they did not understand who it could be. Pa In-chan meanwhile got used to the darkness in a matter of seconds. The master understood that it would take some time for his enemies to get used to this. Using his advantage, the man immediately decided to act. He quickly moved behind the queen of the mountain without making any noise. Pa In-chong could not see the man's face and could only guess that the leader was standing before him. He recognized him only through his senses. Jan Peng looked very scared at this moment. He looked with his empty eyes in front of him and tried to hear at least some sound. As soon as this sound was heard, the man immediately turned his head back and realized that he was in danger lurking behind. Perinjong quickly drew his sword from behind his back and swung the weapon to kill the leader and leave the search party without a king. At the very last moment, Jan Pen saw a sword blade in front of him. He was confused and did not know if he would be able to avoid this blow. In the end, the man decided not to retreat but to block the blow. For this he used his injured hand, putting it under the blade of the sword. This block did not help the man at all. Perinjong delivered a powerful blow that went through and reached the Mountain King's left shoulder. Jan Pen screamed from excruciating pain and a double blow. He was able to avoid death, but this did not improve his situation in any way. Pa In-heng, without thinking long, used his right leg to push his opponent away and imbued it with internal chi. The master delivered a powerful blow to the man's chest, which was not sweet anyway. The king of the mountain screamed again in pain, but he could do nothing. He flew helplessly to some distance, overcoming a wall on his way. He landed hard once again, feeling the strength of his opponent. Pa In-chan wasn't going to stop there. Immediately after the leader, he came to the next opponent who was stationed nearby. The man with the animal skin on his shoulders looked in front of him and did not know what to do. He looked as scared and confused as possible. The warrior looked in different directions and tried to notice at least something. He failed to do this because his eyes were not adapted to the darkness. Meanwhile, Peinchong adapted even more to the environment. He landed quietly right next to his opponent, looking into his eyes. Simultaneously with his landing, the master delivered a powerful blow with his sword which struck the enemy and spilled blood on the floor. The man did not even have time to react to this attack and suddenly felt an unbearable pain in his arm. He was left without his right limb. The village master cut off another arm of his enemy as he had done before. The limb fell to the floor, continuing to pour out blood. The warrior who was injured after this attack fell helplessly to the floor, clutching his arm. That was the end of his match. Peinchan continued to be a landlord in someone else's house. He pushed himself off the floor and headed for his next opponent at the other end of the house. The porcupine-haired man began to wave his arms, sensing danger. He pretended to be a beast and ordered his opponent not to approach. These strange actions of the enemy did not stop the village master. He confidently continued to approach forward, focused on his goal. The man's screams only helped the master to understand his exact location. In a fraction of a second, he was right in front of the enemy's face. Despite the advantage, Peinchong decided to change his plan of action slightly. He did not attack the opponent but literally flew past him. The village master took up his position behind the man. The porcupine-haired warrior sensed the presence of the enemy and almost peed in his pants at that moment. Peinchong, wasting no time, struck his opponent's back with his left palm, releasing an incredible amount of internal qi. An ordinary person could not avoid such a blow. As soon as the palm touched his back, the porcupine-haired warrior began to spit blood. After the collision, the man flew several meters back and met with another wall. He lost consciousness and did not make a sound. Peinchan has dealt with almost all the rivals in the house. He knew there was only one left, the weakest enemy in this room. Suddenly the village master stopped and did not understand what was happening. His murderous gaze suddenly turned sympathetic. He saw before him a representative of the Jinqian Mountain sect holding a sword in his hands and trembling with fear in the face of death. Realizing that he would not be able to do anything against the enemy, the warrior fell to his knees, hoping that the man would decide not to kill him. The man couldn't contain himself in the face of death and let all his fear out, which spilled out in the form of a puddle beneath him. He asked the enemy to spare him and leave him alive. He promised that for the rest of his life, he would do only good deeds and not remember this incident. Peinchan thought about leaving the last enemy alive, but he was well aware that this would threaten his village. The man was ready to risk his life, but he could not endanger the inhabitants of the village who have absolutely no protection. That is why the village master decided to finish off the last rival. He delivered a powerful palm blow directly to his face, knocking him back. The helpless warrior made several flips in the air and crashed hard into the wall. He lost consciousness and could not control his own body. Peinchong decided that he would not finish this man off as he had damaged the flow of his inner energy, so it was unlikely that he would rise again. The situation was different with the king of the mountain. Despite being mortally wounded, Janiel Pen was still conscious and making strange noises. Peinchan approached his main rival and thought that he could leave anyone alive, but he must finish the king on the spot. The village master firmly took his sword, and its blade began to shine under the glow of the full moon, informing the fellow about imminent death. Janiel Pen sat on the floor with his back against the wall. He was barely breathing and could not counter his opponent at all at this moment. Peinchong, without thinking for a long time, moved from his seat and swung his weapon in order to finish off the king of Jinqiang Mountain once and for all. Peinchan began to clear the surrounding areas of Jingchuan Mountain, cutting his enemies to pieces. There are few people left among the living in the forests. Those who managed to survive perfectly understood they're not the best situation, so they hurriedly wanted to leave the battlefield to stay alive. The village master hid in the treetops, watching his enemies. He could see them perfectly, as if they were in the palm of his hand. Peinchan left less than 30 men alive, and even they ran in different directions, so the sweep was almost complete. The task of the master was not to destroy all the enemies to the end, but to protect the residents of the village of Fren and his family. To do this, he had to disgrace his honor as a warrior by setting traps for his enemies in the dark and killing those who posed no threat. When the sweep was complete, Peinchan could finally breathe a sigh of relief and return home to his family, waiting for him with peace of mind. Guanma Gorge was simply an incredible creation. Between the high rocks ran a river along which ships rarely sailed. Norn Pavilion was located at the top of one of the slopes. It was like an incredible fortress that was almost impossible to approach. The ship boldly sailed forward through the gorge. The ship was driven by only one man who rowed downstream, keeping the ship moving. Loud shouts of several warriors could be heard on board who couldn't wait to reach the very top. They looked around and enjoyed the scenery. The only outsider on board was the man who was moving the boat forward. He accompanied the soldiers on board, telling them stories one by one. Finally, the ship arrived at its final destination, and the man dropped the anchor in the water, parking the ship so that the current would not carry it further. Having taken all necessary steps to stop the ship, the man raised his head and shouted loudly, ordering them to lower the ladder. Hearing the order from the ship's commander, the two men immediately hurried to the mountainside and began to worry about how to get their guests up the mountain. They lowered down a bamboo ladder of simply incredible length. It reached right to the ship, and it was possible to climb the mountain. The black-robed warriors looked up and slowly swallowed. It was necessary to climb very high, which certainly scared the men. The captain of the ship, who accompanied the soldiers, smiled and said that everything was not as bad as it seemed, and decided to make an example of a man. He began to climb the mountain and promised that he would help climb the mountain when he himself was there. The ladder, in addition, was wound with a rope. The soldiers decided to trust their leader and followed him. The men scrambled up and tried not to look down so as not to frighten themselves once more. One of the men could not resist and nevertheless looked down. He got scared and started yanking the ladder, thereby shaking the rest of his partners. The soldiers firmly grasped the ladder and stopped. After standing for a while, they realized that nothing was in danger for them because the ladder stopped swaying. The leader told his wards that it is very scary to climb up when there is water under your feet. It is a different matter when there is land there. The wards could not but agree with their captain. After a few minutes, they finally reached the top, and the guide helped all the soldiers to gather on the mountain. As soon as the guests were on the mountain, they were immediately greeted by the head of the Norn Pavilion, Gon Yaren. He immediately greeted Elder Bak, whom he did not expect to see. Elder Bak stepped forward and greeted Chief Gon. He was also pleasantly surprised that the local host came out to meet them. Gon Yaren replied that he could not just sit and wait for Elder Bak to come to his headquarters in person and sit down next to him. Bak expressed his incredible gratitude to the host. He looked at the interlocutor, waiting for him to invite him to his approved headquarters. Having moved to a more comfortable environment, Bak started a conversation about the fortress, which is located on the mountain. The host could not disagree with this fact. Gon Yaren added that despite all the praise from the sects, it was not enough for the fortress because they had fortified themselves here for 200 years. Bak took a cup of tea and thought that the Norn Pavilion really originated here 200 years ago, but ordinary bandits are not allowed to claim such a history. The guest drank some tea and put the cup back. After that, the man decided to move on to the business for which he had come to this dangerous place. Bak wanted the representatives of the pavilion to arrange a passage for him and 3 other people up the Hua to watch their famous competition. Gon Yaren was a little skeptical about this request because he understood that clowns dressed as righteous warriors wanted to invade where they were not invited. The owner replied that the request was very complicated and he needed to coordinate everything with the head of the Trade Bureau of Waterways. Did you also ask, won't this damage the elder's reputation? Bak replied that he just wanted to assess the situation. The man understood that their conversation was reaching a dead end and asked if it would be difficult to send 3 more spectators to the event. This was of course not a problem, but Gon Yaren was well aware that the Wudon sect could not take comfort in the fact that Hua Mountain was still holding on to the top. Looking at his interlocutor, Elder Gon understood that he did not want to be between 2 whales that could eat him at any moment. While the owner was thinking, Bak decided to speed up the brain of the interlocutor. He placed a cloth on the table with something inside. The guest said that he understood the difficulty of his request, so he offered this envelope as well as guarantees in the trade of the Chongerpo Pavilion and the Gwangmo Alliance in the future. Gon Yaren looked at the envelope and thought that there was a small amount inside compared to the zinc that could be obtained from the cooperation with the Chongerpo Pavilion. Suddenly, the meeting of the 2 elders was interrupted by one of the wards. Gon didn't like that very much and reminded him that he had a very important meeting now. The ward apologized and informed the head that it was a very urgent matter. After that, he approached him and whispered some information in his ear. Hearing this, Gon Yaren literally jumped to his feet in anger. He was simply shocked by the fact that someone dared to appear on his territory and lord it here. Meanwhile, Pa In-jung returned home. He went out into the yard with his son to practice martial arts a little. The man was preparing his child for real danger. He delivered a quick strike with his sword that the small boy barely managed to dodge. Despite the danger, little Seo-hyun continued to advance on his opponent. He wanted to prove to his father that he was worth something in this life. Mother and wife sat nearby and put things together. She kept her eyes on her son's training as she cared about him very much. Pushing himself off the ground, Seo-hyun swung his right fist and prepared to attack straight ahead to catch his father off guard. Pa In-chan was too experienced a warrior to fall into such a trap. He easily dodged the blow by moving his head back. Seo-hyun wasn't going to stop there. He pushed off the ground with all his might and began to chase his father, who decided to retreat. Pa In-chan could easily win this match, but he was not fighting at full strength, giving his son the opportunity to hit him at least once. Seo-hyun was a very persistent boy. Despite the huge number of inaccurate blows, he continued to hit with the hope of hitting his father in the head. Suddenly the boys met an obstacle on their way. She turned out not to be a rival at all, a small stone that almost knocked the boy off his feet. Pa In-chan himself did not expect such a turn of events. He stepped back and his son began to fall down, unable to stand on his feet. Seo-hyun was falling down with his mouth open and didn't know what would happen to him. He saw in front of him a sharp blade of a sword which for some reason his father was in no hurry to take away. At the last moment, the village master waved his weapon in front of his child. He did this with a smile on his face, watching the little one. At this moment, the wife rose to her feet and grabbed her face with her hand. She was very scared for the boy who could get hurt in the fight. The reason for the woman's excitement was usually the sharp sword that was in front of the young man's face. Pa In-jong simply turned the weapon 90 degrees. The man's wife closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. Her head had already bled on the battlefield and her son was seriously injured. However, everything turned out to be much easier. The village master turned his sword to the safe side and helped his little one to his feet. Pa In-chan looked at his son's face and smiled pleasantly. Seo-hyun looked at his father with frightened eyes and did not understand what was left of him. The boy's mother could now breathe a sigh of relief. She had already seen the blood on her son's face, but her husband was faster than mortal danger. After this incident, the father explained to his son that he needed a strong lower body so that no stone could upset his balance. Pa In-chan patted his little one on the head and added that in real combat it is very important to keep your balance so you don't get hurt or die. The father suggested that his son continue his training and start controlling his balance using the horse pose. The boy's reaction spoke for itself. He didn't really want to continue training given his fatigue. However, Seo-hyun listens to his father and continues to train in the pose of a master. Pa In-chan, seeing his son's fighting posture, immediately shamed him. He said it was no good at all for the lowest level warrior. The mother also did not like her son's fighting pose. She felt all the shame of her son on her and covered her face with her right hand. Pa In-chan ordered the boy to gather himself immediately and continue to work intensively if he wanted to achieve his goal in the near future. Seo-hyun wanted more than anything to follow his father to Mount Hwa. For the sake of this goal, he was ready to go through any training. After the exhausting training, the father and son went to the tubs of water and refreshed themselves a little to fill their bodies with strength again. The old master of the village of Ren stood to the side and watched the next generations. He paid special attention to his student achieved incredible skill. Black Dan saw his apprentice simultaneously release the inner energy of the purple mist into the sword and control it with extreme skill. Pa In-jeong possessed incredible control over his inner energy and was able to use it to save Seo-hyun from his inevitable fall. The old man looked at his student and understood that he had reached an incredible level, since it is practically impossible to imitate such a thing without reaching the 6th level of true chi. In-chan's wife approached the old man from behind and told him that she had embroidered the 7th plum blossom around the time of their wedding. Black Dan was simply shocked because even the talented disciples of the Hwa Mountain sect, whom she considered to be geniuses, were able to obtain 6 flowers before the age of 40. Pa In-chan stood out from the crowd with incredible talent. He progressed at an incredible pace and at his rather young age already had 7 flowers. Night came very quickly. The light around went out and the family went to their house in the village of Ren to finally rest a little. This rest was not about just one person. In-chan continued his training even inside the house, silently meditating in the lotus position. The man tightly closed his eyes and was not distracted by any external factors. He was only focused on controlling his inner energy. At some point, the village master opened his eyes and began to question himself, did a person like him have no other choice in the Dingjun Mountains? Pa-In-heng was absolutely sure that he had made a strong advance into the Dingjun Mountains, but he still could not understand during the battle what the divine mist was. Now he understood, but he wanted to complete all 7 stages and attain enlightenment sooner. For the man, enlightenment was still only a matter of time. Pa-In-heng drew air into his lungs and exhaled slowly, reassuring himself that even the disciples of the main sect found it impossible to reach such a level. The man looked at his sword and remembered the top master of the Hua Mountain sect, since whose time no one had been able to come close to a similar level of martial arts. Pa-In-chan really wanted to ask someone for advice, but it was impossible. He remained alone with himself and continued to think about the inner energy. The man was pondering the true chi of the purple mist, which was unattainable even for a master, until he suddenly felt someone's presence behind him. Turning his head back, the village master saw his wife in front of him and was very surprised. He asked the woman what she was doing here. The wife apologized and asked if she had interrupted her training. Pa-In-chan replied that everything was perfectly fine and he had just finished. Then the man suggested that his beloved lie down a little and rest because he saw how tired she was from the time when he received the letter. Pa-In-jeong massaged his wife's shoulders and felt them tighten with each passing day. His wife was under constant stress during the week. The master felt that his wife's muscles had weakened greatly due to constant stress. He tried to share a little of his inner energy with the woman. Pa-In-chan did his best and apologized to his wife for his inexperience. He admitted that he couldn't help her at all. The wife opened her eyes and looked at her lover. She replied that he was absolutely not to blame and that her body would soon be as good as new. Pa-In-heng admitted to his wife that the invitation had indeed rekindled the fire in his heart, although he tried to pretend that he had forgotten the existence of the Hua sect. The husband apologized to his wife Mayam for his thoughtless actions and for the last time asked her to be patient a little longer until everything was over. He fixed the beautiful black hair on his wife's head and promised her that he would not worry about the outcome of the competition however it ended. After that, the village master fell silent and took a blanket to cover his wife. He slowly placed the warm blanket over his lover's body. After that, Pa-In-chong slowly bent down to his wife's head and kissed her on the forehead and, wishing her sweet dreams, asked her not to think about anything. The master himself was not going to sleep yet. He confidently left the room and went outside because he still had some plans for tonight. Pa-In-chan took his sword with him and began training. He wanted to achieve his final goal before going to the competition. The village craftsman worked for several hours without resting his hands. He trained under the glow of the full moon, swinging his sword. Pa-In-jong delivered a precise and killing blow using the plum blossom technique. He saw that this technique was still far from perfect in its execution. The village master continued training his inner energy. He raised his sword high, preparing to deliver another precise and killing blow. The sword lingered behind the man's back for a split second, and he thought about channeling all of his inner energy into the tip of the sword. Pa-In-chan swung his weapon with all his might, scattering the plum blossoms around. His technique was almost perfect, but the man felt completely different. Black Dan went outside at night and was simply shocked to see his disciple. He could observe the plum blossom sword essence technique that the man had mastered at a fairly young age. The old man continued to watch his student, who had achieved incredible control over his inner violet mist energy and could transform it with ease. In addition, the old man noticed that Pa-In-heng was able to master a similar technique by skipping the 5 stages and 9 transformations of the plum blossoms. Suddenly, the man noticed how the old man approached him. Black Dan praised the master for his skills and called what he saw true freedom of will and desire. Pa-In-chan lowered his weapon and told the old man that he was still too far away from that. Black Dan did not understand and asked what the man meant. The village master replied that his sword was still too weak compared to the others. Black Dan asked where else he could observe such skills. Pa-In-chong said that 7 years ago he often went to the banks of the Jialing River and once ran into a martial arts master who out of the blue offered him a sparring match. Black Dan asked how it all ended. The man said that he was new to swordsmanship, so he stood still and watched the perfect blows of the plum blossoms. Pa-in-chan remembered the old man with the sword as a true god perfect in martial arts. After striking only 2 blows, the stranger suddenly disappeared. Black Dan asked with surprise, did the man see the sword sage of Manhwa sect? Pa-in-chan assumed that this was quite real because no one else could show such perfect swordsmanship. The man remembered that the stranger had asked the name of his teacher, and now he asked the old man if he had met the sage. Black Dan answered positively. The old man said that he had seen the sword sage of the Mount Hua sect twice and had even received instruction from him, but he had never seen his swordsmanship. Black Dan now understood why his former student was progressing so quickly. He asked if the meeting with the sage really affected him so much. Perinjung smiled and said that it was hard to explain, but he definitely felt some changes within him, and meeting the sage definitely had an effect on him. Black Dan suggested that the man continue his training and once again demonstrate the plum blossom technique to him in order to take a closer look. The teacher and the student continued training for several hours. They slept very little because the sun rose very early in the village. Pa-in-chan began to pack his son for the road from the very morning. He dressed him in new tailor-made clothes, but the boy did not like his new disguise very much. Seo-hyun asked if it was the same clothes his mother had made for him. The father replied that it was exactly the clothes with plum blossoms on them. The guy asked why this robe looked so poor. Pa-in-chan replied that a son should be grateful to his mother. Seo-hyun asked why. The father explained that he had to change his clothes several times to make them looser because the new clothes would be very disturbing during the competition. Pa-in-jeong put his hand on his son's shoulder and advised him to better thank his mother for caring about them even though he is not a martial arts fan. After that, the master played the role of a strict father and asked his son what he would do if they were forced to go their separate ways. Sohen replied that first he would go to Mount Dingjun, from where the road to the Jialing River would open, and then the village of Wuren could be found behind the stream of water. Pa-in-chan was very pleased with his talented son. He raised him to be a very skilled warrior who shows incredible physical and mental abilities for his age. After that, the father could be calm about the safety of his child. He rose to his full height and said that with this instruction they could finally depart. Perinjung helped his son put the small backpack on his back. Seo-hyun fulfilled his dream and was very happy to go with his father to Mount Hua. The village master together with his son finally got together and went outside. Seo-hyun immediately opened his mouth wide in surprise. Almost all local residents gathered in the village of Wuren to see off 2 highly respected people. They saw off their defender with honor. The old woman took a few steps forward and turned to Pa-in-jeong. She asked her husband why he should take Sohen with him at all. It was very difficult to find an answer to this question that even the wife understood. She mentally asked her husband to keep quiet and not say anything. Pa-in-chan seemed to hear his wife and remained silent in response. The old grandmother told the master that he should return as a real hero and arrange a holiday here. Pa-in-jeong bowed his head down and closed his eyes, saying that it would not be easy to do, but he promised to do his best to achieve his goals. After that, the village master approached the interlocutor and took her right hand in his palms, intending to say his last instructions. Pa-in-chan asked the grandmother and everyone present to take care of him while he was gone. The man was very concerned about the health and life of local residents. The grandmother replied that they would do everything possible to stay alive and healthy, and would definitely wait for the celebration that the hero would arrange upon his return. The master turned to one of his students and apologized for placing too heavy a burden on him to protect the village. The man replied that everything is fine. The disciple let the master go ahead without thinking, just to have a little fun. In his opinion, for the teacher, it was just like a normal training session. Pa-in-chan asked his wards not to forget about training because in his opinion 1 missed day was equal to 10 fruitful days of work. The ward smiled and said that he had learned these words by heart over several years, so none of them would miss a day of training under any circumstances. Mijim also said goodbye to her husband and asked him to buy an ornament with flowers to make her black hair look even more attractive. Pa-in-chan smiled back at his wife and said that he would definitely bring her a gift, and it wouldn't be just a single hair ornament. The village master said goodbye to everyone present and promised that he would return as soon as possible, so that his village would again be under the protection of the great master. Local residents saw the man off with a look standing near their houses. They fully supported the master, who decided to participate in major competitions. Pa-in-chan was finally able to set off, taking his son with him. Little Seo-hyun was immensely pleased and headed forward, holding his father's hand. Meanwhile, another ship was sailing in the Gwanma Gorge. In the bright blue and clear water, the crew could see fish circling around the ship. The man who was driving the ship forward was very unhappy with the waves. The wind was not on their side today, which prevented them from reaching the final point. The ship was driven by the same conductor who delivered the sect to the Norrin pavilion. He couldn't understand why the weather always challenged him. On the ship were representatives of the Dingjun Mountain sect. There was absolute silence on the ship, only the conductor sometimes broke it with his stories. The bandits looked askance at their guide, as they did not like to talk very much. In addition, quite recently a not very good event befell them. On the ship were also the wards of Bach, who was now based in the Norrin pavilion. They carefully watched the guests heading to the pavilion. The man who was left with only one hand attracted the most attention. Zhuo Mengdong sat disfigured on the floor, looking down. The guide looked at the man and did not understand what was happening here. During the entire journey, none of those present spoke a single word on the ship. Suddenly, Zhuo Mengdong let out a loud cry, cursing his worst enemy. He still could not come to terms with the loss that had been inflicted on him. The conductor was simply shocked by this turn of events. He did not expect that one of the people present would suddenly start shouting, interrupting the absolutely dead silence around. Jinjun Mountain sect fell to his knees and looked up, cursing his 20 years of life during which he had achieved absolutely nothing. Zhuo Mengdong was in the most insignificant position, which annoyed him greatly. Now he did not have the strength to continue his journey. In a few minutes, the man was already in the Norrin pavilion, where he was supposed to meet with an important person who once let him go from this place. This man was the head of the Norrin pavilion, Gong Yaran. He was not very happy to see in front of him an old acquaintance who dared to come here again. Zhuo Mengdong was perfectly aware of his situation and felt guilty. As soon as the head of the pavilion began to rage, the guest fell to his knees in front of him. Dingjun Mountain sect had no other choice, because now his sect had effectively ceased to exist and it was necessary to ask for help. Zhuo Mengdong could not say a word in the first seconds of the meeting, and simply closed his eyes in shame because he understood the situation he was in. Gong Yaran stared at his former comrade in silence for a while. He barely held back his anger so as not to kill the man on the spot. The head of the pavilion, Norrin, suddenly snapped and shouted that the form really existed if the ungrateful bastard had turned back to the pavilion to ask for help. Gong Yaran asked his guest if he really chose the path of death and came for it on his own too, instead of licking his own somewhere in the bushes. Elder Bach was in the room and heard this speech. He was familiar with the name of the guest, who was one of the leading bandits on Dingjun Mountain. The man wondered what connected them to Chief Gon, because the Norrin pavilion was too powerful a group to associate with the worthless seekers. Bach perfectly saw that Elder Han's eyes were full of hatred and anger. He wondered if an ordinary thug could make such a leader so angry. Gong Yaran wasn't going to hold back his emotions in this dialogue. He took a cup of tea and threw it straight at the head of the kneeling guest. Gong Yaran began to demand from his guest to explain the reason. He had been kind to him in the past, but Zhuo Mengdong had said goodbye to him. The head of the pavilion, Norrin, was not happy to see in himself a man who returned to him not as a triumphant but as a beaten dog that cannot even fight. Bach watched this performance and did not understand why Chairman Gon still had not finished the man, because Bach had heard of the leader's cruelty. Zhuo Mengdong continued to sit motionless on his knees and did not say a word. Suddenly he apologized to his older brother, whom he had been friends with in the past. Zhuo Mengdong said that he could no longer tolerate the master's words, that he was not equal to the other brothers, so he decided to leave the Norrin pavilion. The man added that he wanted to prove that he was worth something more and left to create something similar to the Norrin pavilion and not depend on anyone. Gong Yaran only laughed at the fact that his younger brother had become one of the leaders of a seeker gang that was not even worthy of recognition from other sects. The head of the pavilion, Norrin, asked the guest if he had betrayed him in exchange for such an insignificant position, and now came back to justify himself. Zhuo Mengdong agreed with the pavilion chief, but added that Dingjun Mountain had its own mountain lord who was a completely incompetent leader. The man said that his will really created history, although it looks rather meager in the eyes of the older brother who listens to this story. Zhuo Mengdong admitted his guilt but emphasized that he had succeeded in creating a great force that was ready for anything through his sweat and tears. Elder Bach listened carefully to the man's excuses and could tell that he had done a very good job with the Seekers despite their reputation as common thugs. Gong Yaran still did not recognize the achievements of his younger brother. He yelled at him again, calling the gang of Seekers trash and waste. A force that has existed for more than 10 years, the head of the Pavilion Norin called a bunch of useless idiots who betrayed their leader at the most important moment. Gong Yaran agreed to take back his words if his guest named a ward who had not betrayed him. Those present in the room could barely contain their laughter. Elder Bach turned to his charges and ordered them to shut their mouths. The wards immediately apologized to the leader and promised to behave as quietly as possible. Bach again turned his face to the main show and began to think about the term of loyalty, which was completely uncharacteristic of bandits. Suddenly the man wondered who was so strong that he could destroy the group of seekers that had existed for more than 10 years on Dingjun Mountain. Gong Yaran told his guest to get out of his sight immediately, for a man who had lost his spirit and his right arm could no longer be considered a warrior. Zhou Mengdong admitted his defeat. He wanted to gather all those who did not belong to the Manhwa sect and finally spread his wings, but he couldn't do anything. The man blamed only one person who killed absolutely everyone. Zhuo Mengdong added that he only knew about his enemy, the origin of the Manhwa sect. The guest fell to his knees in front of the host and said that the priest who betrayed the leader was already dead. Zhu Mengdong asked to fulfill one last request in memory of their childhood. Gong Yaran was very hostile towards his younger brother. He looked at him with evil eyes and wanted to tear him to shreds on the spot. Elder Bach looked at the head of Norin Pavilion and did not understand what the man would do at all. Absolutely everyone froze in anticipation of a further decision. Zhuo Mengdong raised his eyes and looked at his elder brother. He hoped for at least a drop of compassion to remain amid all this hatred. Zhuo Mengdong put out his last request to his elder brother, which simply shocked the master of the Norin Pavilion and let out a loud cry. Gong Yaran couldn't believe that his younger brother was seriously asking him to deal with the mess he had made all these years. The head of the Pavilion Norin was already unable to contain himself, and Zhuo Mengdong sat silently in his seat and hoped for a better result. Suddenly Elder Bach intervened in the dialogue. He apologized for interfering but still expressed his opinion and advised to listen to the man. Gong Yaran was also angry with his second guest. He turned to face him and mentally asked himself why this bastard was interfering as well. Suddenly the head of the pavilion came to his senses and realized that he had been too emotional. He forgot about the presence of Bach's head and said too much. Gong Yaran immediately apologized for his emotionality and explained that he had completely lost his sense of reality. Bach replied that he had to go himself. However, he had already stayed here, so he asked the leader of the pavilion to listen to this man because everyone was interested to hear the circumstances under which Mount Dingjun fell. Gong Yaran didn't really want to leave his guest here and listen to his excuses, but he couldn't refuse Bach because of his excessive politeness. Based on this, pavilion head Norin turned to face his younger brother and told him to tell the story from beginning to end. Zhuo Mengdong told everyone present the story about the fall of Dingjun Mountain and the unknown master who dealt with the entire army all by himself. Bach was simply shocked by the result of this story. He couldn't even imagine that the head of Hren village was a member of the Hua Mountain sect. Zhuo Mengdong had finished his story and was now looking at the reactions of everyone present. He did his best to throw himself a life jacket. Bach's ward elders began to whisper among themselves and express their opinions, which was definitely not on the side of Dingjun Mountain. Instead, Bach began to think about how to solve this problem. On the contrary, he wanted to help Mount Dingjun as he saw his benefit in this. However, the man faced one problem. This problem was Pe Inchan, whom the guest described as a real monster. Bach looked at one of the village master's victims and wondered if a person in their right mind would go against a huge army even if they were confident in their abilities. The man assumed that this could be a lie, and Zhuo Mengdong was simply overestimating the enemy's capabilities, since he had suffered a fatal defeat in battle. Zhu Mengdong once again emphasized that everything heard by those present is the complete truth, and there is absolutely no need to lie to him. The head of the pavilion Norin listened to his guest without too much emotion. Everyone looked at the injured man who wanted help. Bok suddenly realized that the story was really true because a man does not need to lie, but on the contrary he needs to underestimate the strength of his enemy. Gong Yaran still stood his ground, but after this answer he began to wonder if he could really join this adventure. Without thinking for a long time, the owner of the pavilion Norin gave a clear answer that he could not help. Zhuo Dong did not expect such a sharp response. He asked his elder brother to think again because Hven is just a small village that will not stand in the way of the enormous power of the Norin pavilion. Gong Yaran replied that he was refusing not because it would be difficult for him, but because he could look into the future and foresee the consequences. Gong Yaran heard the interlocutor's story that he had caught 2 priests of the Manhwa sect, and in this case the situation takes on completely different colors. The owner of the pavilion reminded his guest that he is already at the bottom of the swamp, but he is still trying to drag his former allies with him. Zhuo Dong bowed his head after this answer and became very upset. He understood that his older brother was still resentful of him and would not help. Meanwhile, one of Bok's wards approached his boss and decided to share an idea that suddenly came to his mind while watching this performance. Elder Bok listened attentively to the idea of his ward and recognized that it could indeed be a good one. The man immediately took action after that. He approached the head of the pavilion and asked to listen to his opinion once more. Bok said that after listening they will have an opportunity to help the man. Zhuo Dong was just shocked to hear this answer. He could not even expect that someone present would suddenly speak out against the host. Gong Yaran was no less shocked than the others. His guest again intervened in the dialogue, which the man did not like very much, but he did not show it. Bok explained that they couldn't just attack the village of Hven, but the priests of the Manhwa sect did not join the fight by chance, but rather they were allies of that monster. Bok came to the logical conclusion that Perinjung had most likely received an invitation to the martial arts tournament, so the other contestants would be able to beat him there. Zhuo Dong was just shocked when he heard the suggestion from the elder. Bok asked the opinion of the head of the pavilion to take his life with him. Gong Yaran looked at his younger brother with anger on his face. He recalled how the master was disappointed in his skills and did not want to take him as an apprentice at all. Zhuo Dong proved after some time that he is the best in planning and defense. Gong Yaran believed that the younger brother would be able to see things through. However, Zhuo Dong was defeated and now asked for one last wish. The man had nothing to lose. This was his last chance for revenge. Gong Yaran turned his head back and replied to Elder Boku that he could take this nothing with him if he found it useful. Bok decided that the chairman also agreed to his previous request for the account of the Hanzhong Waterways Bureau and asked about it again. Zhuo Dong watched the dialogue between the 2 elders and saw a glimmer of hope for himself because now he would be able to enter the Dragon Festival. At any cost, the man wanted to meet Perinjung again and take revenge on him for what he had done to the Jinjun Mountain sect just a few hours ago. Following the plan, Zhuo Dong went to the Hanzhong Waterways Bureau. Here he needed to agree on very important support. As soon as the guest entered through the front door, he was immediately greeted by Master Xie, who was the head of the Waterway Bureau. The man appeared very suddenly. Zhuo Dong turned to face the interlocutor and introduced himself as a representative of Norin Pavilion, expressing his incredible paper to the master. Master Xie was pleasantly surprised by the man's manners. He asked him to sit down so they could discuss all the troubling points in more detail. Zhuo Dong brought with him a letter from the leader. The plan was to enter the martial arts competition at Mount Hua under the guise of an escort. After looking at the letter from the leader, Master Xie immediately described it negatively to himself because 6 guards were too many for him. Zhuo Dong understood the man very well, but he tried to persuade him. He promised to take on all the unpleasant tasks that would be encountered on the way to Hua. Master Xie received a very good offer. He had to take 6 people with him, and in return he received free passage through the strait for 3 months. Despite this, the master said that 3 months would not be enough for him and offered his terms that the number of months coincided with the number of guards taken. Zhuo Dong explained that he could provide such an opportunity, but his charges would not understand it, so he asked the master to wait for 4 months. Master Xie was pleasantly surprised by the courtesy of his guest. 4 months was a very good offer, so the man decided to accept this offer anyway. The host laughed and said that he would be glad to be accompanied by 6 young masters with whom he would go tomorrow. Zhuo Dong thanked the master. Master Xie had his conditions. He added that none of his bodyguards could do as they pleased without getting permission from their boss. Zhuo Mengdong agreed to this small condition from the interlocutor and finally achieved his goal. He was now almost an arm's length away from Pe Inchan. Hanzhong Road Gongmeng led directly to the main scene of the past 20 years. There were significantly more people on the street with weapons in those days. Everyone behaved very carefully on the central road. The warriors who were participating in the competition for the first time looked like ordinary tourists who had come to see the city. A lot of men were very cautious with their weapons. Contestants were easy to recognize because they were constantly evaluating other people. Entrepreneurs who sold their goods were also located on this street. One of the merchants was driving flies away from honey which no one had bought yet today. The men watched the huge flow of people, but absolutely no one paid them any attention. They could not understand whether their business was so unprofitable. Businessmen could not help but notice that the number of people with weapons had increased significantly, which scared them a lot considering possible robberies around. The men knew very well that the Dragon Festival would be held very soon. One of the entrepreneurs even knew that Master Xie from the Waterways Bureau would also be involved. Also, this entrepreneur added that this is not his first tournament, so he knows perfectly well that among these people with weapons there are many imposters who just want to look at the competition. He emphasized that many people want to get a free ticket to the tournament, so they join the participants with their tails as if accompanying them. It was almost impossible for an ordinary person to get into the tournament, so some even resorted to bleaching the corals, but this was not the best idea. 360 participants took part in the tournament, so the number of people could increase together with the guides. Master Xie was rumored to be taking as many as 10 guides with him. After hearing the story from his colleague, the man said that he would also like to watch the dragon competition if he could at least buy a ticket somewhere or accompany someone. This man was a cloth merchant, and he really didn't like the fact that only men with swords were walking around scaring women away from his goods. It is a different matter if the entrepreneur were selling food. In his opinion, this business would be very profitable considering the incredible number of meat lovers around. Another businessman wondered why his son didn't do martial arts, because in that case they would both get to the big event. Hanzhong Road Gongmeng also took in Pe Inchan and his young son. The travelers looked around. Xiao Hyun was incredibly impressed. The Great Hanzhong Hotel District was the most crowded place on the eve of the dragon tournament held by the Manhwa sect. Zhuo Mengdong wandered along the narrow street, turning his head in different directions. He came here only to find one person. The man carefully looked at the faces of each passerby and tried to recognize Pe Inchan, as he was sure that he would arrive at this particular place. Ignoring a single passerby, Zhuo Mengdong bumped into the man. They bumped their shoulders, and at the same time she stopped in place. The stranger turned his head back in displeasure and began to get angry at the oncoming passerby, telling him to look more carefully under his feet next time. Zhuo Mengdong really wanted to reciprocate the unkind interlocutor, but he was in no hurry to do so because he remembered his weakness. In the end, the Seeker sect member left the scene holding his left shoulder. He thought that if the limb had been in place, the stranger would certainly not have gotten better. Zhuo Mengdong could only rely on the disciples of the Wudong sect, since only they could break into the village and destroy all the enemies. The man in turn could only hope for luck, since meeting his worst enemy could only be helped by luck. Zhuo Mengdong did not make any progress near the hotels and decided to leave the square. People here were constantly changing and the central square was replenished. Pa Insheng and his son arrived at Great Hanzhong Street. Xiao Hyun was just shocked because he had never seen such beauty before. The village master took his son with him for the first time outside the village of Kviren. The father offered to carry the child, but the little one said that he was not tired. Pa Injiong perfectly understood that Xiao Hyun just wanted to be strong in his eyes, but in reality he was incredibly tired after 4 hours of travel. Pa Inchan still offered his little one somewhere to stay and asked where he wanted to settle. Xiao Hyun is just shocked to hear such a question. The guy began to turn his head in different directions and could not stop at one hotel because there were simply an incredible number of them around. One of these was a hotel called a guest house. The 2-story building with a balcony on the top floor looked very solid and attracted visitors. The hotel, which bore the name of the Kan River, was less popular than its counterpart, but it was also quite attractive. Many visitors came here themselves. The hotel of satisfied guests had only 1 floor and did not look like much. But it attracted guests as the prices here were not too high. Injeong fixed his gaze on the hospitality hotel as it had the most people. His son held the same opinion and pointed his finger in front of him. He pointed directly to the guest house and said that this hotel looked better than all of them, so Seo-hyun wanted to stay in this particular house. In-chan liked the luxurious option for him and his child. He immediately agreed with his son and allowed him to go inside. It was very crowded inside the guest house. The representatives of the Heavenly Dragon Tournament gathered in the hall where they could drink tea and talk. Maybe all the tables in the hall were occupied where visitors rested before an important event. There was an atmosphere of fun and entertainment around. Opposite, it was possible to observe a completely different atmosphere. People with weapons kept coming in and out of the hall, which could frighten the average visitor. The new guest was immediately greeted by a hotel employee. He greeted and smiled kindly. Injeong said he wanted a one-room clean room. As soon as the hotel employee wanted to give the keys to the room to the visitor, he immediately received a slap on the back of the head and fell silent in surprise. A colleague of the man with a shaved head continued the conversation with the visitors and informed that at the moment only the deluxe rooms are available in the hotel as the regular rooms are occupied. Injeong asked what it all meant. The hotel employee explained that a deluxe room will cost 2 niang, which is twice as expensive as a regular room. Of course, the village master was not very experienced in such matters, but even considering his worthless experience, he felt that they wanted to deceive him. In-chan turned to his son and said they were going to another hotel. Seo-hyun fully supported his father and looked askance at the hotel worker. The man who was ready to give the room asked his colleague what it was all about. The interlocutor replied that the opportunity to earn more money from customers should not be lost. His colleague was indignant and threatened to tell the owner about this incident next time. The bald man did not care and only laughed at his interlocutor. He did not have time to do this when he suddenly realized that outsiders could listen to their dialogue. The man cast his frightened look to the left and beckoned. He saw in front of him incredibly angry visitors who could hear the entire dialogue. The villagers were not very satisfied with the local workers. In-chan was ready to kick the ass of the unfriendly workers until suddenly he heard a familiar voice behind him calling his name. And turning his head back, the village master saw in front of him a man named Hek Jeguk who was very happy to see his old friend. After saying hello, Hek Jeguk asked the master what he was doing here. In-chan replied that forced circumstances had brought him to the central street of this city. Hek Jeguk was very surprised that the master was about to leave the hotel because they were supposed to have dinner any minute. The man missed that the village master stayed in another hotel. In-chan replied that he had not settled yet, but was going to do so somewhere else where he would not be charged 2 niang for a regular room. After realizing what was the matter here, Hek Jeguk immediately turned to the employees of this hotel and asked in a displeased voice if they were tired of living in the world. The benevolent employee immediately turned everything on his mercantile colleague, who wanted to profit from the visitors and rent them a room at twice the price. Huck immediately approached the man and asked him if he really wanted the innkeeper to break his legs. The employee began to apologize and explained that he did not know that these were acquaintances of the master. Hek Jeguk put his fist in front of the employee's face and explained that all visitors should be treated equally regardless of origin. At the moment when the man was ready to tear the worker to pieces, In-chan intervened and asked his old friend to stop abusing the worker. Hek Jeguk explained to his friend that the owner of this hotel is his friend, but this man is younger than him, although you wouldn't tell from his appearance. In-chan was very surprised because the shaved man really looked much older. The village master outside his residence could not observe very strange things. Meanwhile, not far from the venue of the tournament, battles were taking place. Swords clashed against each other on the battlefield, measuring each other's strength. The man with the huge sword was forced to take many blows. The forces at will were unequal, but unfamiliarity was not going to give way in a duel. An old gray-haired man in green clothes was surrounded. He tried to fend off a huge number of blows and counterattack at the same time. These old men were the Lord of the Cloud Sword officers who was on his way to the Heavenly Dragon Tournament but encountered trouble on his way. Several men in black clothes and masks attacked him at the same time. They were good at martial arts, although it was not clear at first glance. Their leader was still standing still and just watching the fight. It didn't matter to him that his wards were dying in battle with this old master. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers shouted loudly on the battlefield as he prepared to attack. He informed his opponents that he was not going to leave anyone alive. Immediately after these words, the old man took several quick steps forward and began to raise his huge sword, which he wielded very skillfully. He covered him with a flow of his inner energy. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers began swinging his weapons in various directions with incredible speed. Opponents were simply amazed by the techniques of their enemy. They could not have expected such a speed and only had time to notice the glint of the sword. In a split second, the old master left two of his opponents headless. The men did not have time to blink an eye as it ended up in the other world. At this, the men in black did not stop attacking their target. They constantly tried to surround the old man in order to attack from all sides at the same time. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers noticed the danger behind him in time and turned back to deliver a powerful blow with his cloud green sword. The bandit was cut in two because he did not have time to block the blow. His gaze before death was completely blank and he did not understand what was happening. Literally after a fraction of a second, a sharp dagger quickly flew through the opening between his halves of the body without touching a single piece of skin. The leader of the bandits who shot the Cloud Sword officer lord had absolutely no regard for his charges and only attacked the target in front of him. The old master was simply shocked at how precisely his enemy had worked. He saw a sharp dagger in front of him, but it was too late to dodge. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers was forced to take the hit. His right shoulder was pierced through by a knife that flew away with great speed. The black masked thugs stood still in their places and watched the common enemy that had just been successfully attacked by their leader. The old master, despite a very serious wound, was able to stand on his feet and did not let go of the weapon. He stood where he was clutching his wound. The last encounter angered the master even more. He shouted loudly as he prepared to attack. His expression told that it was better not to anger the old man. In a split second, he was surrounded by his enemies. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers swung his weapon with all his might, forming a veritable cloud dance around him. The leader of the bandits saw the weak side of his enemy and immediately approached him at the right distance, starting to cut his opponent into small pieces. The old master was unable to resist such a force. He began to fall helplessly to the ground and even released his huge sword from his hands. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers was defeated in this unequal battle. His body was cut into several parts. The wounds were too deep to continue the fight. Feeling incredible weakness and loss of blood all over his body, the old man fell helplessly to the ground, hitting his knees on the hard ground. The old master dropped to the floor and looked down. His body was mangled and continued to bleed, losing his life. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers raised his confident gaze upwards and wished to know from the opponents what was the purpose of their attack on him. The leader of the squad that attacked the old master slowly reached his right hand towards the black mask to speak to the defeated opponent openly. The man removed the mask from his face and whispered in a low voice that he was very sorry, but it was a necessary measure to complete the mission. The old man could not understand what was happening. He perfectly understood that the bandits were waiting for him, but he wanted to know for what purpose. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers asked why the enemies would hide their presence at all if their level of martial arts was at an incredible level. The bandit leader didn't say anything and simply held out the sky dragon in front of the invitation to the tournament. He said that he only needed this envelope. The old master said that he could just give this invitation to stronger opponents and they could avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The leader of the bandits said that he was very sorry, but you can't change anything, so the old master can only die in this field. The Lord of the Cloud Sword officers said that the leader sacrificed not only his life but also the lives of his charges, who were completely innocent. The enemy replied that he had no other choice and added that his life would soon come to an end so they could meet in the next world. The old master looked at the man with frightened eyes and called him a bastard, asking where in the world such junk comes from. The leader of the bandit squad closed his eyes and did not answer the old man. He decided that everything can be demonstrated directly in practice to the defeated opponent. The man took out his sword and said that the old man would find out before his death who took his life, and maybe this would help him find peace in the next world. The leader of the bandits swung his sword wide, creating an incredible wave of light. The wards stood behind him and watched this in silence. The old master was simply shocked to see his enemy's skills, which he did not even use in battle, and the lord was still defeated. Before the master's throat was cut, he spoke his last words, calling his opponents crazy bastards who would stop at nothing. The leader of the bandit group agreed with the old man and left the battlefield. He had completed his business and could now go to the Heavenly Dragon tournament. In parting, the man once again told the old man who was lying on the floor and bleeding that they would meet very soon, so they said goodbye for a short time. Peo-in-chan was invited to a dinner party where he met the Iron Sword demon Ma Gu-yong, whom they hadn't seen in over 2 years. An old acquaintance asked the master about his teacher. Peo-in-chan replied that the old man was slowly recovering and could walk on his own. Ma Gu-yong talked about his affairs and reported that he had been forced to look after Haek Jae-hak for a while, as he was unable to take care of himself. The man got angry and said that the teacher was giving him the opportunity to express himself. Haek Jae-hak really wanted to get married and have a family like Peo-in-jeong. Ma Gu-yong decided to suddenly change the topic of conversation and switched to Seo-hyun. He was surprised how the little one had grown up so quickly and asked him to come to him. Seo-hyun was not really prepared for such an event and choked on food. The boy was forced to chew and swallow quickly to get to his grandfather. Ma Gu-yong asked the boy how his mother was doing. Seo-hyun replied to his grandfather that everything is fine with mom and dad always helps her. Suddenly the old man asked the man where he was going with his son. Peo-in-chan replied that he had taken Seo-hen with him to Mount Hwa. Ma Gu-yong looked at the interlocutor with a serious look and asked him if the rumors about the situation at Dingjun Mountain turned out to be true. Peo-in-heng didn't really want to discuss this situation and looked down. The man said in a low voice that he did it for the safety of his village. Ma Gu-yong simply asked the interlocutor about this, but his assumption turned out to be true. He couldn't understand if the master was really that strong. He remembered the words of Chorin-dan, who couldn't really judge his students' abilities. Previously, the man believed that he was simply exaggerating his skill. Doubts crept up on him when 5 years ago Peo-in-chan single-handedly destroyed a gang of seekers protecting his village and scaring the bandits away for several years. Ma Gu-yong smiled and admitted that the village master would surpass him very soon, as fighting an entire army was very brave. Peo-in-chan replied to the interlocutor that he exaggerates his achievements because he tends to think that he was just lucky to win. Meanwhile, Haek Jae-hak thoroughly enjoyed his dinner. He grabbed food from the bowl at an incredible speed, stuffing his stomach as much as possible. The teacher didn't like it a bit and decided to interrupt his student's meal. He knocked the bowl out of his hands, which literally shocked the man. Ma Gu-yong reminded his student that he needed to train hard. Haek Jae-hak denied that he did everything he could to become stronger. Haek Jae-hak called his teacher a cranky old man. Ma Gu-yong told the disciple as he sipped his tea that he should now switch to the Black Dragon sword. Haek Jae-hak didn't really want to fight for the minor prize in the tournament. The teacher decided so as Peo-in-jeong aimed at the heavenly sword. Ma Gu-yong didn't really like his student's reaction and decided to hit him again. He ordered to shut up and warned that he would have no chance. Haek Jae-hak dodged the blow and asked the teacher if he had really started us together, since the dialogue can be continued without a fight. The man got up from his seat and said that he wanted to win the heavenly sword so that all the girls would fall at his feet and he could choose his bride. Haek Jae-hak turned to the village master and reminded him that he already had a wife, so there was no need for him to win this tournament. Ma Gu-yong told the disciple not to obsess over women, as they are still bones with skin. Haek Jae-hak advised his teacher to remarry. Ma Gu-yen really disliked the behavior of the disciple he had trained and nurtured for so many years. Haek Jae-hak replied that there was more work to be done. Peo-in-chan watched the conflict between the two sides with a smile on his face. In 2 years he managed to miss the constant screams that rang out from all sides. The interlocutors spent several more hours at dinner and then went to bed. Tomorrow was a very important day for them because it was time to leave. The morning of the next day came almost imperceptibly. The sun greeted the cozy hotel with its rays, waking up all the visitors through the window panes. Peo-in-chan and the old teacher had already gathered for morning tea. Ma Gu-yong asked the young man a question he had forgotten to ask yesterday. The old man asked if the boy was still there. Peo-in-chan slowly exhaled and silently shook his head, answering the interlocutor's question. Ma Gu-yong guessed that Black Dan must be very upset about this. Peo-in-chan replied that the old man really got stuck after this situation. Suddenly loud screams and pounding of hooves were heard near the hotel. Almost at the central entrance, a whole herd of horses passed by accompanying an important person. Haek Jae-hak had just woken up to loud noises outside and had no idea what was going on. One of the waiters explained that Lord Xie had most likely gone to Mount Hwa. The man also added that the rumors turned out to be true. Lord Xie did go on a trip today even though there were still 2 days left before the start of the competition. Hake Jaehak went down to the hall where his allies were drinking tea. The teacher immediately put the cup on the table and began to discuss the passing Master Xie. Ma Guyang called the competitor not a very restrained person, although he understood that not everyone would be able to wait 20 years and Lord Xie had already named his successor. Hake Jaehak turned to face his teacher and asked the insect if his son-in-law, who was said to be a very good warrior, was his successor. Ma Guyang turned to the village master and said that Xie was very much like his teacher, even if he didn't even manage to get any awards. Pa In-chan looked at the interlocutor with a calm and sad look without giving any answer. He was still thinking about his master who had lost his power. In a few hours, the allies were forced to go on a journey. A long road awaited them which would finally lead Pa In-chan to Mount Hua. Unlike the rich representatives of Mount Hua, Pa In-jong was from an ordinary village, so he did not have horses or guards around him. He went forward with his son and allies on his own feet. Hake Jaehak entertained his son on the way so that the little one would not be sad. Pa In-chan constantly watched their silly games and understood that sooner or later the little one might get tired and not reach the mountain as promised. Pa In-chan did not really want to carry his son on his back as he himself was tired. After all, the man could not forbid the little one to play a little games at his age. Hake Jaehak continued to bore the little one, trying to entertain him and himself. Suddenly they encountered an obstacle in the form of several people. Hake Jaehak immediately stopped talking to the village master's son and raised his head. He realized that their games could end there. The man saw in front of him bandits who were armed to the teeth. Their leader stood in front and looked down on the people traveling through the fields. Seo Hyun was excited to meet his first enemies. Hake Jaehak immediately pushed the little one back as it was too early for him to engage in bandit combat. The man asked the strangers what the goblins were doing in the field in broad daylight. He ordered the bandits to immediately tell them about the sinister intentions. The leader introduced himself as Sang-do, a spirit thief from Namjong village. He was quite well known in narrow circles and asked if travelers sometimes knew him. Pa In-chan and his guides knew absolutely nothing. They were in no hurry to answer and tried to remember the face of this bandit. Absolutely none of the men remembered Sang-do's name. Only Pa Yijong remembered seeing a very similar face in their shared hotel yesterday. Hake Jaehak, on behalf of all his allies, informed the stranger that absolutely no one knew his name, so he apologized for his short memory. Sang-do understood that he was not very famous, but he controlled the surrounding areas so travelers should know whose territory they were entering. The leader of the bandits said that yesterday in the hotel he overheard the men's conversation, and he did not like that they were discussing their victory in the tournament. Sang-do informed the travelers that they could not go to Mount Hua because they did not deserve it because of their superiority. Hake Jaehak asked his teacher's opinion. Ma Guyang concluded that they had met with some branch of the Hua sector if they knew about the qualification and some other subtleties of the tournament. The leader of the robbers looked at his interlocutors with an absolutely indifferent look and replied that they had not guessed and that they were not members of the Mount Hua sect. Upon hearing this answer, Ma Guyang immediately realized that they had met the invitation hunters who had become very popular groups last time. Hake Jaehak was very pleased as he had been right about the bandits from the start. He asked the strangers what they were going to do now. Sang-do continued to look at his potential opponents with an indifferent gaze. He needed only one thing to receive an invitation to the tournament. As soon as Hake Jaehak spoke his last words, the members of the bandit group raised their swords aloft, announcing their intentions. Sang-do said that they are not like ordinary thugs because they are doing their thing for a noble goal that anyone can achieve. Pa In-chan and the teacher decided to leave the man alone. Hake Jaehak wasn't too pleased when he felt the wind at his back. He asked the teacher if he would have to fight the bandits himself. Ma Gai-yang promised the student to send help in the form of Seo Hen if things were bad. Pa In-chan warned the man that the boy would be watching the match and did not want to see blood, so he advised his ally to be as careful as possible. Hek Johek turned to his adversaries and asked if they would really fight warriors who had a child with them and even a teenager. Sang-do thought that they were of course completely unknown warriors, but they had the right to enter the popular tournament and not be inferior to all the minor branches. The leader of the bandits did not like that the potential opponent continued to taunt them, not even knowing their intentions in this duel. Sang-do immediately ordered his charges to attack the stranger, and they headed in the direction of the target. Hek Johek found himself in a not very pleasant situation. Now the man understood that the fight would definitely not be avoided. He exhaled slowly and scratched the back of his head, showing his indifference with all his appearance. The robbers rushed into battle against their enemy, displaying all their weapons in front of them. They shouted loudly before striking. Hak Jae-hak remained standing in his place and watched his opponents. He understood that the fools did not pose any threat to him. The man reached for his sword as the enemies approached the right distance. He asked himself if the bandit leader was going to die on the spot. He didn't really want to kill his opponent, not only because he was asked to do so by Porinjong, but his hands immediately reached for the sharp sword. Sang-do stopped abruptly and realized that he was in danger. He did not expect such speed from the enemy from whom he wanted to take the invitation. Hak Jae-hak sharply drew his sword from its scabbard and delivered a powerful and accurate strike, knocking the opponent's armed arm directly behind his back. The enemy of the robbers was simply shocked at this turn of events. He stopped in a motionless pose, holding his spear directly above his head. After this counterattack, Sang-do began to think that they were indeed facing a dangerous opponent who would easily win. The man's wards did not understand this yet, so they simultaneously attacked him from several sides. Hak Jae-hak stood still and saw every movement of the enemies. Almost in unison, the bandits delivered a powerful double strike with their swords, hoping that the opponent would not be able to react quickly. Hak Jae-hak didn't even rush to dodge this attack. At the last moment, he arched his back and bent down to stay unharmed. After that, the man had to make a coup in the air. The opponents continued to advance but did not pose any threat at all. Hak Jae-hak dodged every attack from his opponents with ease. They were not well versed in martial arts and were unable to hit the target. Sang-do finally came to his senses and, gathering his strength, decided to attack again. He put spy salve in front of him and was going to pierce the enemy through. Hak Jae-hak had completely different views on this situation. He arched his back again and easily avoided the blow, which was delivered too slowly. Hak Jae-hak saw his opponent's weak point again. His hands were itching to strike, but he decided to restrain himself for a while. The man didn't want to hurt anyone, considering his ally's request. That is why so far the man used only the agility of his legs in battle. Dodging the last attack, Hak Jae-hak pushed off the ground with all his might and was at the right distance to take a break. Pa-in-chan was watching his allies fight carefully all the time. He did not expect such a movement from him and even thought about whether he should join. Hak Jae-hak did a flip in the air and landed with one foot on the ground. He was at a distance where no enemy could reach him. The man kept his eyes on his enemies, who remained on guard. Until now, the bandits did not even suspect that the enemy was not fighting at full strength. Ma Guyong called his disciple a fool for not being able to deal with ordinary thugs, and before that he was going to win the Heavenly Dragon Sword. Hak Jae-hak reminded the teacher that it was his first time fighting against the three rivals, and in addition, Porinjong asked that no blood be spilled on the battlefield. The master looked at his student with a serious look and called him a fool because he does not pay attention to the fact that he is already being attacked from behind. The leader of the robbers decided to take advantage of the moment when the opponent was distracted. He quickly went behind him and delivered a powerful blow with his spear. Without even turning his head back, Hak Jae-hak did a backflip and dodged the blow with ease. Sang-do couldn't believe his eyes again. Hua Mountain Sect landed behind his opponent, putting him in an awkward position and causing him to spin his head in different directions. Sang-do stopped his frightened look on his opponent's face and couldn't believe that he had dodged again, and without putting in any effort at all. Ma Guyong reminded his disciple that one should not lose concentration on the battlefield. Hak Jae-hak asked since when the student's safety has been a concern of the old maniac. For the rest, the man admitted that his teacher was right, because losing vigilance in a battle with several opponents is unwise, especially while conducting a dialogue in parallel. In addition, Hak Jae-hak encountered enemies on his way for the first time and wanted to gain experience, as this was the perfect moment to practice his skills. Without thinking for a long time, Hak Jae-hak decided to finally fight seriously. He shouted loudly, alerting his opponents of the danger from his side. After the battle cry, the man suddenly moved from his place, leaving behind only dust that spoke of his incredible speed. Hak Jae-hak literally flew towards his opponents, who stood in one place and waited until the enemy was in the palm of their hands. Sang-do chose what he thought was the right moment to attack. He delivered a powerful blow with his spear when the enemy was several meters away from his face. However, everything turned out not at all as planned by the leader of the robbers. He found himself isolated after the final blow was struck. The man was simply shocked and did not understand what was happening. He could not follow the enemy who had managed to restrain his movements with ease. Hake Jahak began to move upwards, spinning in the air. He wanted to demonstrate his full bloom plum technique, which he did very well. Pa-in-chan was pleasantly impressed by his ally's skill, though he didn't show it. He coldly watched what the man would do next. The old teacher had a similar reaction. He held baby Seo-hyun in his arms, and the two of them watched Hake Jahak perform the technique. The robbers were simply shocked to see plum blossoms with their own eyes. In addition, it was a very complex technique that involved flowering in full. After what they saw, all the robbers realized that from the beginning their enemy was not bluffing. I was really attacked by someone I shouldn't have been. Hake Jahak continued his dance, twirling in the air. He used the 9 plum blossom technique, attacking all the opponents at the same time. Sandu knew enough about this technique to understand that the situation was not good. He told his charges to dodge, but it was too late. Bandits couldn't figure out how to dodge the flashes of light that were literally everywhere. They began to scream, loudly begging for help. Their leader was also unable to defend himself. As the plum blossom began to approach him, Sang-do closed his eyes and began to say goodbye to life. However, the leader of the robbers made hasty conclusions about the situation. The equipment suddenly dissipated and he found himself in complete safety. Not understanding what had happened, the man slowly opened his eyes and saw that he was no longer in danger and his life was not hanging in the balance. Hake Jahak told his enemy to relax and promised not to touch him again if the thugs got out of here immediately and stopped squirming. The man was incredibly pleased with the result of this match. In addition, he behaved like a real hero, which definitely pleased Hake Jahak. Ma Guyong was still unhappy with his disciple and asked if he was just going to let the enemies go like that. Hake Jahak asked if the old frenzy had reawakened. Pa-in-chan said that the man showed himself quite well, it was just that the sparring partners were too weak. According to the master, the tournament should have been a very good experience for his partner. The village master suddenly asked the teacher if Hake Jahak had practiced the jade ring sword. Ma Guyong wondered why he had decided that way. Pa-in-chan explained that he carefully observed the movements of a warrior who applied a lot of force to the plum blossom technique. Then the master decided that it was the result of another technique. Ma Guyong laughed and said that he had heard such words in the past. The man said that masters once refused to believe in his potential. The teacher went on to say that together with his friend, they quickly mastered the two-headed dragon, but after that they could not make any progress. Ma Guyong admitted that the teachers even wanted to stop him from studying, but one day, he met the holy sword of Mount Hua, who recognized him. The man said that he received advice from the master to work on creating his unique plum blossom sword and complement it with footwork. Pa-in-chan now understood what the old teacher was getting at. This is how the jade ring match was born, which Hake Jahak was able to master. Ma Guyong looked at the conversationalist and said with a smile that thanks to this training he had personally managed to transform a two-headed dragon into a three-headed one. Hake Jahak interrupted the master and asked him what he should do with the defeated bandits, because for some reason they are in no hurry to take their heels from here. Sandu apologized to the grand old master and asked him to take them with him, to the absolute shock of everyone present. Ma Guyong asked if the leader of the bandits really thought that the master could take with him to Mount Hua the bandits who were trying to take possession of other people's invitations. Sang-do explained that this is the first time he has crossed the border because he really wants to enter the Heavenly Dragon Tournament, which is his life's goal. As he continued to talk about common people not being able to enter the tournament, the robber reached into his pocket to show off his savings. He took out a bag and said that it contained 50 niang, which he had managed to accumulate during his life to get to Mount Hua one day. Ma Guyong was simply shocked to see such a large amount of money in front of him. Seo-hyun continued to sit on his grandfather's lap and also looked at the robbers. The master thought about the fact that you don't need money to participate in the tournament, but you need a lot of money to feed the guests and pay the charity contribution. Ma Guyong decided that the robbers had obtained such a large amount illegally and asked how many people they had to kill to get this money. Sang-do replied that he had never done anything like that in his life. The man said that his family had been producing and selling wine in Hanzhong for centuries. Ma Guyong decided to consult with his eldest son. He turned to the village master and asked what he thought about this. Pa-in-chan thought that he would really like to stop the thugs, but he understood that for some reason the teacher didn't chase them away right away, so there must be something else to it. The village master did not express his categorical opinion and told the teacher that he can act as he sees fit in this situation. Ma Guyang didn't say a word and just looked at his youngest son. Haek Jae-hoon immediately understood that his father wanted him to make a quick decision. The man turned to face the robbers and said that the teacher seemed to have decided to take pity on them, but that didn't mean they would take them with him. To avoid misunderstandings, Haek Jae-hong first ordered the robbers to remove the money. The leader was in no hurry to do this and did not understand why it was necessary. When the younger brother realized that the thugs were not listening to him and decided to break their legs, Sang-do quickly followed the order. Haek Jae-hong said that before going with them to Mount Hwa, the bandits should remember a few important things in order to stay alive. Haek Jae-hong told the robbers to call him older brother, despite Pe-injian, who is actually his older brother. The man added that robbers should consider the teacher as their master, but not to turn to him in the presence of other people, but to ask for an older brother. Haek Jae-hong generally advised the robbers to keep their mouths shut. Sang-do listened carefully to the interlocutor and said that they would agree to any terms. Haek Jae-hoon suddenly thought of another condition. He removed the pack from his back that was weighing him down a bit and handed it to his new ally. The man was very pleased to be left without an extra load, which he handed over to his new younger brother, who was now doing the dirty work.